Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was a chilly Friday evening in late October, and I was driving back from a work trip in a small town about 3 hours away from home. The year was 2018. My car, a well-used sedan, hummed along the empty highway under a pale moon. The road stretched for miles, flanked by endless fields of dry grass. The air felt unusually still, and the headlights cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the asphalt. I wasn't alone on this trip. My buddy, Neil, had come along for company. Neil and I had been friends since high school, bonded by our shared love for road trips and late-night drives. He was riding shotgun, fiddling with the playlist on his phone, while I focused on the road. We'd spent the day at a client meeting that had dragged on longer than expected. By the time we left, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. We were tired, but in good spirits, chatting about everything and nothing, occasionally laughing at old jokes that no one else would find funny. The night seemed like any other, the kind of uneventful calm you expect when driving through rural highways. We stopped at a gas station about an hour into our drive to grab coffee and snacks. Neil got an iced latte despite the cold, and I stuck with black coffee. The cashier, an older woman with a warm smile, warned us about deer on the road. "They're everywhere this time of year," she said, her voice carrying a hint of concern. The rest of the drive resumed as usual. The coffee kept us warm, and the music filled the silence of the empty stretch ahead. The occasional passing car felt like a reminder that the world wasn't entirely asleep. Neil and I had always enjoyed these late-night drives. There's something soothing about the monotony of the road and the quiet companionship of a trusted friend. The world feels simpler when you're cruising at 60 miles an hour, the hum of the engine drowning out your thoughts. The route we took was one we'd driven before, a narrow, two-lane highway bordered by thick woods on one side and open fields on the other. It wasn't particularly scenic, but it got the job done. The GPS said we'd be home by midnight if we kept up our pace. But as we drove deeper into the night, something about the air began to change. It wasn't the temperature or the sound, it was more like a feeling. Subtle at first, like the faint static of an untuned radio in the background of your mind. I glanced at Neil, who seemed oblivious, tapping his foot to the beat of some upbeat tune. "You good?" I asked, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "Yeah, man." "Why?" He looked at me, puzzled. "No reason," I replied, brushing it off. The road ahead was empty, save for the occasional reflective glint of an animal's eyes in the distance. The moonlight painted the landscape in shades of gray, giving everything an otherworldly glow. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettling, like the calm before a storm. About 30 minutes later, Neil suggested we stop for a quick stretch. He claimed his legs were stiff from sitting too long. I pulled over at a small clearing by the side of the road, and we stepped out. The air was crisp and quiet, almost unnervingly so. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We stood there for a moment, sipping our drinks and looking up at the stars. "It's kind of creepy out here, isn't it?" Neil said, half joking. "A little," I admitted, trying to laugh it off. We didn't stay long. After a few minutes, we were back in the car, eager to put the strange atmosphere behind us. As we pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The clearing was already swallowed by darkness, but for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a shape standing at the edge of the road. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or a shadow from the trees. I didn't mention it to Neil. The drive continued, but the feeling of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. The highway seemed emptier than it should have been, and the stretches of road between the occasional mile markers felt longer. Then, out of nowhere, Neil said something that made my blood run cold. "Do you feel like we've been driving in circles?" "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "I don't know. It's like this road never ends," he replied, staring out the window. "Like we're stuck or something." I laughed nervously. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Something about the road felt wrong, as if we'd left the familiar behind and entered some liminal space that wasn't entirely real. That's when we saw a car, sitting in the middle of the highway, hazard lights blinking. It was the only vehicle we'd seen in what felt like hours, and it was abandoned. The car was sitting dead center in the middle of the highway, its hazard lights pulsing like a metronome against the darkness. It wasn't just parked on the shoulder, it was directly in our lane, as if it had been abandoned mid-drive. Neil was the first to speak. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, slowing the car as we approached. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and my heart began to race. The vehicle was a mid-sized sedan, dark gray or maybe black. It was hard to tell under the limited moonlight and the orange flash of the hazards. As we got closer, the scene became more unsettling. The driver's door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The headlights were off, but the hazard lights blinked steadily, casting brief flashes of light across the empty road and the trees beyond. I eased my car to a stop about 20 feet behind it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The engine idled softly, the only sound besides the rhythmic click of the hazards. "Do you see anyone?" Neil asked, leaning forward in his seat to get a better look. "No," I replied, scanning the area. The highway was deserted, the surrounding fields and woods shrouded in shadow. If someone had been driving that car, they weren't anywhere in sight. "Maybe it broke down," Neil offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," I said, though my gut told me otherwise. There was something off about the whole situation. Cars don't just stop in the middle of the road with the door left open, not unless something unusual had happened. "We should check it out," Neil said, reaching for the door handle. "Wait," I said quickly, stopping him. "Let's think about this." Neil looked at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "What's there to think about? If someone's hurt or stranded, we should help them." I couldn't argue with that, but the unease gnawing at my chest made me reluctant to leave the safety of our car. "What if it's a trap?" I asked, voicing the thought that had been circling in my mind since we'd first spotted the car. "A trap? Like what?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's just, this doesn't feel right." Neil hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, fair. Let's be careful." We sat there for a few more seconds, neither of us wanting to make the first move. Finally, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. "I'll check it out." "You stay here." "No way," Neil said firmly. "If you're going, I'm going." I sighed, knowing there was no point arguing. "Fine, let's just stay close." We stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting against my skin. The highway was eerily silent, and the only light came from the blinking hazards and the beam of my phone's flashlight. As we approached the abandoned car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes darted to the tree line, but all I saw was darkness. The car was in worse shape than I'd realized. The front bumper was dented, and the windshield had a large crack running across it. The driver's seat was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, dangling loosely. Neil peeked into the back seat. "Nobody's here," he said, his voice low. "Doesn't look like it," I replied, shining the flashlight into the interior. The seats were worn, the floor littered with fast food wrappers and an empty water bottle. It looked like an ordinary car, except for the circumstances in which we'd found it. "Where do you think the driver went?" Neil asked. "I don't know," I said, glancing around again. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, and the surrounding fields offered no sign of movement. Then I noticed something. A faint smear on the driver's seat, just below the steering wheel. It was dark and slightly sticky. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. Is that blood? Neil asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I think so, I said, my throat dry. We both stepped back instinctively, as if the car itself had become dangerous. The logical part of my brain told me there was probably a simple explanation, an injury, a hasty departure, but the primal part of me screamed that we needed to leave. What do we do? Neil asked, his earlier curiosity replaced by unease. We should call someone, I said, pulling out my phone. But as I unlocked it and opened the dialer, I realized we had a problem. There was no signal. Great, I muttered, holding the phone up as if that would make a difference. Neil checked his own phone and shook his head. Same here. No bars. The sense of isolation was suffocating. We were miles from the nearest town, alone on a deserted highway with an abandoned car and no way to call for help. We need to keep moving, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll find a signal eventually. What about the car? Neil asked, gesturing to the abandoned vehicle. There's nothing we can do, I said. Whoever was driving it is long gone. We'll report it as soon as we get service. Reluctantly, Neil nodded, and we headed back to our car. But as I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. For the next few miles, Neil and I sat in silence, our earlier camaraderie replaced by a tense unease. The road ahead seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the abandoned car following us. But the highway behind us was empty, save for the faint glow of the hazard lights fading into the distance. The unease didn't fade as we drove on. If anything, it grew stronger, pressing down on us like a weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something we didn't understand, something we weren't meant to see. And then Neil broke the silence. Did you hear that? Hear what? I asked, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. Listen, he said, his voice urgent. I turned down the music, straining to hear whatever it was that had caught his attention. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the tires on the asphalt. Then I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside the car. Do you hear it now? Neil asked, his voice low. Yeah, I said, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get our attention. And then it stopped. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Neil and I exchanged a glance, our unease palpable. I scanned the highway through the windshield and rearview mirror, but the road ahead and behind us remained empty, the darkness stretching endlessly in both directions. Maybe it was just the car, Neil suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. The car's running fine. That didn't come from inside. Neil shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Let's just keep going. The sooner we're out of here, the better. I didn't argue. Pressing down on the gas pedal, I sped up, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and the abandoned car. The highway seemed endless, a ribbon of black stretching through the desolate countryside. The headlights illuminated only a small patch of the road ahead, the darkness beyond impenetrable. The tapping might have been dismissed as a one-off, a strange but ultimately harmless occurrence, if not for what happened next. A few miles down the road, the radio cut out. 1 second it was playing low, barely audible music. The next, it was emitting a burst of static that made both of us jump. What the hell? I muttered, reaching for the volume knob. Neil leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the radio. Is it broken? I don't know, I said, twisting the knob back and forth. The static persisted, loud and grating, before it abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was somehow worse. And then a voice crackled through the speakers. It was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. Help! Neil's eyes widened. Did you hear that? I nodded, my hands tightening on the wheel. Yeah. Try changing the station, he urged. I turned the dial, but every station was the same static, interspersed with faint, incomprehensible voices. Some were too garbled to make out, but others sent chills down my spine. Can't find them. Alone in the dark. Please help. Neil's breathing grew shallow. Turn it off, he said. I didn't hesitate, pressing the power button and plunging the car into silence. But the unease lingered, thick and oppressive, as if the voices were still with us, whispering just out of earshot. What the hell is going on? Neil asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, I admitted, but something's not right. The next strange event happened shortly after. As we rounded a bend in the highway, the headlights caught something in the middle of the road, a figure standing perfectly still. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car skidded to a halt just a few feet away from the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. He stood motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides, as if he hadn't even noticed our car barreling toward him. Neil and I stared at him, too stunned to speak. The headlights illuminated his figure, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. And then, without warning, he turned and walked into the woods. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness. What the hell was that? Neil whispered. I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. We should get out of here, he said urgently. I didn't argue. Shifting the car into gear, I accelerated, my eyes darting to the tree line as we passed. But the figure was gone, vanished into the shadows, as if he'd never been there. The tension in the car was unbearable. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel Neil's unease radiating from the passenger seat. My own nerves were frayed, every shadow on the road ahead taking on a sinister shape. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, we saw the car again. It was the same dark sedan, its hazard lights blinking steadily. Only this time, it was parked on the shoulder of the highway, as if it had somehow moved on its own. No way, Neil said, his voice barely above a whisper. It can't be the same car, I said, though I didn't believe my own words. We passed it slowly, our headlights illuminating the cracked windshield and the open driver's door. It was exactly the same dents, the same blood smear on the seat. Neil turned to look at it as we drove by. What the hell is going on? I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. I pressed down on the gas pedal, determined to put as much distance as possible between us and that cursed car. But as we continued down the highway, the tension only grew. Neil kept glancing out the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. Do you feel like we're being watched? He asked. Yes, I admitted, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The sensation was almost tangible, like an invisible weight pressing down on us. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a primal instinct, a deep-seated awareness that we weren't alone. The next time we saw the car, it was parked across the road, blocking both lanes. My foot hit the brake instinctively, and the car came to a screeching halt. The sedan's hazard lights blinked steadily, casting an eerie glow across the pavement. What do we do now? Neil asked, his voice tinged with panic. I don't know, I said, my mind racing. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the soft hum of our engine and the rhythmic click of the hazard lights. And then, slowly, the driver's door began to close. It didn't slam shut, it moved deliberately, almost methodically, as if an unseen hand was guiding it. Neil and I stared in stunned silence as the door clicked shut, leaving the car sealed and motionless in the middle of the road. That's it, Neil said, his voice shaking. We're turning around. I didn't argue. Shifting the car into reverse, I backed away, my hands trembling on the wheel. But as I turned to check behind us, my breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing in the road, directly behind our car. It was the same figure we'd seen before, tall, thin, and hooded, his face obscured. He stood perfectly still, his presence more menacing than anything I'd ever encountered. The figure behind us didn't move. He stood in the middle of the road, silhouetted by the faint glow of the moon. His posture was unnervingly rigid, his presence radiating an unspoken threat. My chest tightened as I gripped the wheel, every nerve in my body screaming at me to act, to do something, but I was frozen. "Do you see him?" Neil whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," I managed to choke out, my hands trembling against the wheel. "Is he coming closer?" Neil asked, his breath quickening. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The figure hadn't moved an inch, but his stillness felt unnatural, as if he were waiting for something or someone. "I don't think so," I said, though my voice wavered. "What do we do?" Neil pressed, panic creeping into his tone. My mind raced, weighing our options. The sedan was still blocking the road ahead, and the figure stood behind us, trapping us in place. The air inside the car felt suffocating, thick with fear and uncertainty. "Stay here," I said finally, unbuckling my seatbelt. "What?" "No, you can't go out there," Neil protested, grabbing my arm. "We don't have a choice," I said firmly, though my heart was pounding. "If we stay here, who knows what'll happen?" Neil's grip tightened. "This is insane." "I'll just check the sedan," I said, though the words felt hollow. Maybe there's something there, something that'll explain all of this. Reluctantly, Neil let go, his face pale and strained. "Be careful," he said, his voice cracking. I nodded, swallowing hard before opening the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sending a shiver down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, to lock the doors and floor it, but I forced myself to step out. The highway was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the sedan's hazard lights. Each step felt heavy, my boots crunching against the asphalt as I approached the car. When I reached it, I peered inside. The interior was just as we'd seen before, blood smeared on the seat, the keys still dangling from the ignition. But now, there was something new. A piece of paper lay on the passenger seat, stark white against the dark upholstery. I hesitated, my breath hitching. Slowly, I reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The hinges creaked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I grabbed the paper, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven handwriting were 4 words. "You are not alone." A chill ran down my spine, my heart hammering in my chest. I backed away from the sedan, clutching the paper tightly. When I turned back toward our car, my blood ran cold. The figure was gone. "Neil!" I shouted, breaking into a run. As I neared the car, Neil rolled down the window, his face pale and panicked. "What is it? What happened?" I held up the paper, shoving it through the window. "Look at this." Neil grabbed it, his eyes scanning the words. His hands shook as he crumpled the paper, throwing it onto the dashboard. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I said, jumping back into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. I shifted the car into reverse, but as I glanced at the rearview mirror, my heart sank. The figure was back. This time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, just as tall and ominous, their faces hidden beneath identical hoods. "They're multiplying," Neil whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond. My hands shook as I shifted the car back into drive, my eyes darting between the figures behind us and the sedan blocking the road ahead. And then, without warning, the sedan's hazard lights flickered off. The sudden darkness was blinding, disorienting. For a moment, I thought the sedan might disappear altogether, swallowed by the night. But then, its headlights turned on, blinding and piercing through the darkness. I shielded my eyes, my heart pounding. What the hell is happening? The headlights flared brighter, impossibly bright, until it felt like the entire world was bathed in their harsh, unrelenting glow. And then, just as suddenly, they shut off. The highway was plunged into complete darkness. "Neil," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" There was no response. "Neil?" I turned to look at him, but the passenger seat was empty. Panic surged through me. "Neil!" I shouted, my voice echoing into the void. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a faint glow in the darkness. I dialed Neil's number, my hands shaking, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Neil!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard a faint, distorted voice. "Help!" It was the same voice we'd heard on the radio, but now it was closer, louder. "Neil, is that you?" I called out, my heart racing. The voice grew louder, echoing around me, but it wasn't coming from any single direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. And then I saw them. The figures emerged from the darkness, dozens of them, their hooded forms blending into the night. They moved in unison, their steps slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. I scrambled to start the car, my fingers fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, but as I looked up, the figures were there, standing directly in front of the car. Their faces were hidden, but I could feel their gaze, piercing and unrelenting. And then, for the first time, one of them moved. He stepped forward, raising a hand to point directly at me. A single word echoed in my mind, though no one had spoken it. "Run!" My body trembled, my mind racing as that single word reverberated in my head. Run. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, clear and urgent. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The tires screeched, fighting for traction on the cold asphalt. The car lunged forward toward the figures blocking the road. My heart pounded in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. The hooded figures didn't flinch. They stood motionless as the car barreled toward them, the headlights cutting through the darkness. At the last moment, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for impact. But it never came. The car passed through the figures as if they weren't there. A chill enveloped the interior, sharp and biting, like stepping into an icy void. I gasped, gripping the wheel tighter, my breath visible in the freezing air. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone. "Neil!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The passenger seat was still empty, his absence a gaping hole that filled me with dread. I sped down the highway, the dark road stretching endlessly ahead. My mind raced with questions. Where had Neil gone? What were those figures? And why had they let me go? I reached for my phone, fumbling with it as I tried to call Neil again. The line buzzed, and for a moment, I thought it would go straight to voicemail. But then, there was a faint sound on the other end, static, broken by garbled whispers. "Neil," I said, desperation thick in my voice. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, a chilling phrase cut through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hooded figures again. But the road behind me was empty, swallowed by the night. I drove for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard told me it had only been minutes. The highway seemed endless, the landmarks I'd passed earlier nowhere to be seen. It was as if the world outside the car had ceased to exist, leaving me trapped in an infinite stretch of road. And then, up ahead, I saw it, a faint light, flickering like a beacon in the darkness. My heart leapt. Was it another car? A rest stop? A sign of life? As I drew closer, the light resolved into the familiar glow of a gas station. Relief flooded through me. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching on the gravel. The station looked old and weathered, its neon sign buzzing faintly. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady beneath me. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I hardly noticed. My focus was on the station, its interior dimly lit, but inviting compared to the oppressive darkness outside. I pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly. The clerk behind the counter looked up, his face lined with age and weariness. "Need help?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, swallowing hard. "My friend is missing." We were driving on the highway, and these things appeared, hooded figures, and then he was gone. The clerk's expression didn't change. He simply stared at me, his gaze steady and unblinking. "You're lucky you made it here," he said finally. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He gestured toward a faded map on the wall behind him. "This stretch of highway, people talk about it. Strange things happen out there. Disappearances, ghost cars. Folks say it's cursed." My stomach turned. "Cursed? By what?" The clerk shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. Some say it's a burial ground. Others think it's something older, something that doesn't like being disturbed." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That doesn't help me find Neil." The clerk's gaze softened. "If your friend's still out there, he's got to find his own way back. There's nothing you can do but keep moving." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was happening on that highway, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. "Do you have a phone I can use?" I asked finally. The clerk nodded, pointing to an old rotary phone in the corner. I picked up the receiver, dialing Neil's number one more time. This time, the call went through. "Hello?" Neil's voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Neil," I shouted, relief flooding through me. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm somewhere. Dark. I can't see anything. It's cold, and I feel like they're watching me." "Stay where you are," I said, my voice firm. "I'm coming to find you." "You can't," Neil said, his voice breaking. "They won't let you." The line went dead. I slammed the receiver down, my hands shaking. The clerk watched me silently, his expression unreadable. I turned to him, my voice shaking with desperation. "How do I get him back?" The clerk sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Sometimes you don't. Sometimes they come back on their own. And sometimes they don't." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. I staggered back to my car, my mind a whirlwind of fear and helplessness. I sat behind the wheel, staring out at the dark highway. Neil's last words echoed in my mind. "They won't let you." But I wasn't going to give up. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway. The figures might be waiting. The darkness might be endless. But I wasn't leaving without Neil. The miles stretched ahead, endless and suffocating, as the highway swallowed me whole once again. The headlights of my car illuminated nothing but asphalt and shadow, a stark reminder of how isolated I was. The world outside felt like a distant memory, and my only tether to reality was the faint hope that Neil was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me. But the further I drove, the more I felt it, an oppressive presence, like unseen eyes boring into the back of my head. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the uneven road. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, each more terrifying than the last. Where was Neil now? What were they, those hooded figures that had stood so eerily still, blocking our path and then vanishing like smoke? And why had I been allowed to pass, only to be left haunted by their chilling message? "You shouldn't have stopped." The words felt like a warning, a cruel joke, and a condemnation all at once. I don't remember when I started crying. The tears came silently, streaking down my face as I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white with tension. My chest felt heavy, my breath shallow and ragged. I was losing him. And worse, I was losing myself in this endless nightmare. I don't know how long I drove. The clock on the dashboard seemed meaningless, its glowing numbers ticking forward with no regard for the hell I was trapped in. The gas gauge crept closer to empty, but I kept going. Stopping wasn't an option, not here, not now. Eventually, I saw something in the distance, a faint glow shimmering on the horizon like a mirage. My heart leapt, a mix of hope and dread. Was it another gas station? Another illusion? Or something worse? As I got closer, the glow resolved into the unmistakable flash of emergency lights. A police cruiser was parked on the shoulder, its red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Relief surged through me as I pulled over, my car rolling to a stop just behind the cruiser. I stepped out, the cool night air biting at my skin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Is anyone there?" A figure emerged from the driver's side of the cruiser, a man in uniform, his face illuminated by the strobe of the lights. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his eyes that made my stomach twist. "You lost?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "My friend," I said quickly. "We were driving on this highway, and he disappeared. There were these figures, hooded figures, and then he was gone. Please, you have to help me find him." The officer studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he nodded. "You're not the first person to say that." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "This highway," he said, gesturing to the dark road stretching behind him. "It's different. People vanish out here. Cars are found abandoned, drivers missing. Some come back. Most don't." My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the car for support. "But why? What's happening here?" The officer shook his head. "No one knows. Some folks blame the land, say it's cursed. Others think it's something supernatural. All I know is, the best thing you can do is turn around and leave. Don't look back." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I can't do that," I said, my voice firm. "Neil is still out there. I can't leave him behind." The officer sighed, his expression softening. "I get it, but you're risking your own life by staying. If you go any further, there's no guarantee you'll make it out." "I don't care," I said, my hands clenched into fists. "I'm not giving up on him." The officer studied me for a long moment before finally nodding. "If that's your choice, I won't stop you. But be careful, and if you see them again, don't stop." He turned and walked back to his cruiser, the door slamming shut behind him. The lights flickered off, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. I climbed back into my car, my resolve hardening. I wasn't leaving without Neil, no matter what it took. The road ahead seemed darker than ever, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. I gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of him. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light a potential threat. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this place. And then I saw him. Neil was standing on the side of the road, his silhouette illuminated by the car's headlights. Relief and disbelief flooded through me as I pulled over, the tires skidding on the gravel. "Neil!" I shouted, throwing the door open and running toward him. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. But something was wrong. His eyes were empty, his movements sluggish, as if he were struggling to stay upright. "Neil, it's me," I said, reaching out to him. "We have to get out of here." But he didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing toward the road behind me. I turned, my blood running cold. The hooded figures were back. They stood in a line, their forms barely visible in the faint light. And this time, they weren't alone. Behind them, the darkness seemed to writhe, shapes moving and shifting in the shadows. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Neil, we have to go," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't move. "Neil, please." The figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. I grabbed Neil's arm, pulling him toward the car. He resisted at first, but then, as if waking from a trance, he started to move. We reached the car, slamming the doors shut, just as the figures reached the edge of the light. I threw the car into gear, the engine roaring as we sped away. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, an oppressive weight that pressed down on us as we drove. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road. Eventually, the highway gave way to familiar landmarks, streetlights, buildings, signs of civilization. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. Neil hasn't been the same since that night. He's quieter, withdrawn, as if part of him never left that highway. And sometimes, late at night, I catch him staring out the window, his expression distant and haunted. I don't know what we encountered on that highway, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain, I'll never drive that stretch of road again. Some roads are better left untraveled. It's the kind of memory that lingers, creeping back into your thoughts when you're alone or when the silence of the night becomes deafening. It happened during the summer of 2012. I had just turned 28, and I was living in a small apartment in the outskirts of Philadelphia. Life wasn't particularly exciting, but it wasn't bad either. I worked as a night auditor at a local hotel, and my schedule had me awake during the hours most people were asleep. My days were spent running errands, watching TV, and occasionally meeting up with my best friend, Eric. We'd known each other since high school, and he was one of the few people I could count on for company during those odd hours. Eric was the kind of guy who had a knack for finding odd places to explore. Abandoned buildings, forgotten roads, old factories. If it was slightly off the beaten path, Eric knew about it. It wasn't uncommon for him to show up at my place late at night with a new idea for a mini adventure, as he called them. One evening, he arrived with that familiar glint in his eye, holding a weathered notebook in his hand. "I found something you're going to love," he said. He flipped open the notebook to reveal a map of a forgotten train line. The map looked ancient, with faded ink and torn edges. Eric explained that he'd come across it at a flea market. It showed a train station not far from where we lived, a station neither of us had ever heard of. It wasn't listed on any modern maps, and Eric, being Eric, was convinced it was the perfect place to check out. I wasn't immediately sold on the idea. After all, it was late, and I was still wearing my work uniform. But Eric had a way of convincing me. Maybe it was his enthusiasm, or maybe it was the fact that I didn't want to spend another night watching reruns of The Twilight Zone alone. Whatever it was, within an hour, we were in his old sedan, heading toward the spot marked on the map. The drive itself was uneventful, a blend of dark country roads and the faint hum of Eric's radio. We passed through a series of small towns, their streets eerily quiet at that hour. As we got closer to the location, the roads became narrower, the trees on either side pressing closer together. Finally, we reached a dirt path that led into the woods. Eric parked the car at the edge, and we continued on foot, guided by the faint glow of his flashlight. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and wet earth. At first, the walk felt like any other late-night trek through the woods, quiet, slightly unsettling, but ultimately harmless. We chatted about work, old memories, and the ridiculousness of going out to find a train station in the middle of nowhere. But as the path stretched on, the atmosphere began to shift. The air felt heavier, and the woods seemed unnaturally silent. Finally, we saw it, the station, or what was left of it. The building was small and crumbling, hidden among the trees like it had been swallowed by the forest. Vines crept up its stone walls, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. A single wooden sign hung above the entrance, its letters barely legible. Redwood Station. Eric was thrilled, his flashlight dancing over the building like a spotlight. "This is it," he exclaimed, stepping forward. I followed hesitantly, the unease in my chest growing stronger. We explored the exterior first, noting the rusted tracks that disappeared into the woods and the boarded-up ticket booth. There was no sign of recent activity, no footprints, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone had been here in decades. It was as if the station had been forgotten by time itself. Eric was already pulling at the boards covering the door. "Come on," he said, grinning. "Let's see what's inside." I hesitated, glancing back at the path we'd come from. Something about the place felt wrong. But Eric's excitement was infectious, and before I knew it, we were stepping inside. The interior was as decrepit as the outside, with broken benches and shattered windows. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. For a while, it was just us, poking around and making jokes about ghost trains and cursed conductors. But then, something changed. There was a sound of faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal outside. But as we stood there, listening, it became clear that the sound was coming from inside the station. Eric froze, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was steady, deliberate, like someone tapping a stick against the floor. And that's when I saw it, a shadow moving in the far corner of the room. I grabbed Eric's arm, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go." But Eric, always the skeptic, shook his head. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The shadow moved again, this time closer. "Eric," I said more urgently, "we need to leave. Now." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be like any of our previous adventures. Something was here with us, and it wasn't friendly. The tapping grew louder, echoing off the crumbling walls of the station. It wasn't random, like an animal skittering across the floor. It had a deliberate rhythm, as if someone or something was trying to get our attention. Eric aimed his flashlight toward the source of the sound, illuminating the far corner of the room. At first, we saw nothing but shadows dancing across the dust-covered floor. The beam caught on a pile of debris, old newspapers, broken glass, and splintered wood. "See? It's probably just that," Eric said, his voice a little too casual. He took a step forward, kicking the debris lightly with his foot. The tapping stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its place. "Okay, weird," he admitted, glancing at me. I wasn't convinced. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But Eric was already moving deeper into the station, his curiosity outweighing any sense of caution. "Wait," I said, my voice tight. "Don't go too far." He turned back to me with a grin, but even in the dim light, I could see the unease in his eyes. "Relax, man. There's nothing here but us and a lot of dust." I stayed close, unwilling to let him wander off alone. We moved through the main room, our footsteps crunching on the brittle floorboards. The air felt heavier now, like we were being watched. Then we heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the corner, it was behind us. I spun around, my heart racing. The flashlight beam darted across the room, illuminating empty space. Nothing was there. No animals, no branches brushing against the walls. Nothing. "Okay," Eric said, his voice lower now. "That's strange." He was trying to stay calm, but I could see the tension in his posture. For the first time, it felt like he was taking this seriously. "Let's just check out the other room and then head back," he said. "We've seen enough." I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to bolt. We moved cautiously toward a door at the back of the station, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. Eric pushed it open, the creak echoing loudly in the stillness. The room beyond was smaller, with a few overturned chairs and a desk covered in old, faded papers. It looked like it had once been an office or storage space. As Eric sifted through the papers, I stayed near the doorway, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I noticed something odd. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. There were faint marks, like someone had dragged something heavy across the room. "Eric," I whispered, gesturing for him to come over. He joined me, his flashlight following my gaze. "What is that?" he muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The marks were erratic, crisscrossing the floor in no clear pattern. They led to the far wall, where they abruptly stopped. "It looks like tracks," he said. "But from what?" Before I could answer, we heard a new sound. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Eric nodded, his face pale. The whispering grew louder, but we couldn't make out any words. It was like a low murmur coming from all around us. I backed away from the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We need to go," I said again, this time with more urgency. Eric didn't argue. We turned to leave, but the door we had come through slammed shut with a deafening bang. Eric ran to it, yanking at the handle. "It's stuck," he said, his voice trembling. "Let me try," I said, pushing past him. The handle was ice cold, and no matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now. It felt like it was pressing in on us, suffocating. Then the tapping started again. This time, it was coming from above us. We both froze, our eyes snapping to the ceiling. The flashlight beam revealed long, jagged cracks in the plaster, but no sign of what was making the noise. "Eric," I said, my voice shaking, "we have to get out of here. Now." He nodded, his bravado completely gone. We turned toward the other side of the room, where a second door led to what appeared to be a stairwell. We pushed through, the door creaking loudly. The stairwell was narrow and dark, the steps crumbling under our weight. We descended quickly, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. But the sounds followed us. The tapping, the whispers, they were relentless. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in another room. This one was even smaller, with bare concrete walls and a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Eric shone his flashlight around the room, his hands trembling. That's when we saw it. In the center of the floor was a small, rusted box. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. "Don't touch it," I said immediately, my gut churning. Eric hesitated, his curiosity warring with his fear. But before either of us could do anything, the light bulb went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The tapping stopped. So did the whispers. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice low, guttural, and unmistakably human spoke one word: "Leave." We didn't wait for a second warning. Eric grabbed my arm, and we bolted back up the stairs, tripping over ourselves in our haste. When we reached the main room, the door that had been stuck was now wide open. We didn't question it. We ran out of the station and back into the woods, not stopping until we reached the car. As we drove away, the station faded into the darkness behind us. But the unease lingered. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken fear. We didn't know what we had just encountered, but one thing was clear. Whatever was at Redwood Station didn't want us there. And it wasn't done with us yet. The drive home that night was eerily silent. Eric clutched the steering wheel, his knuckles white, while I stared out the window, my mind racing. The events at Redwood Station replayed over and over in my head. Each sound, each shadow etched into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left it behind. When we reached my apartment, Eric barely waited for me to get out before speeding off. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow expression I didn't recognize. For a moment, I stood there, watching his taillights disappear into the night. Once inside, I locked the door and checked it twice, something I hadn't done in years. The familiar comfort of my home felt foreign, the quiet oppressive. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but every sound, every creak of the floorboards or hum of the refrigerator felt amplified, like I wasn't alone. The night passed in fragments of restless sleep. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard tapping at the window or a faint whisper in the hallway. Each time, I forced myself to check, only to find nothing there. By morning, I was running on adrenaline and coffee, my nerves frayed. When Eric called around noon, his voice was shaky. "We need to go back," he said abruptly, skipping any pleasantries. "What? Why?" I asked, my stomach twisting. I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. "That place, the sounds, the box. It's like it's following me." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, but the truth was, I felt the same. There was an unspoken pull, a gnawing curiosity mixed with fear. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him later that day. We arrived at Redwood Station just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. This time, we came prepared flashlights, a crowbar, and a vague plan to uncover whatever secrets the station held. The building loomed before us, its weathered exterior somehow more menacing in the fading light. As we approached, the oppressive silence returned, the kind that seemed to absorb every sound. Eric led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Inside, the air was colder than before, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. We retraced our steps to the smaller room where we'd found the rusted box. The marks on the floor were still there, as if frozen in time. Eric crouched beside the box, hesitating before lifting it. "Should we even touch this thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric didn't answer. He pried it open with the crowbar, the lid creaking as it gave way. Inside were a few tattered photographs, a pocket watch, and what looked like a diary. The photos were old, sepia-toned, and faded. They showed people, men and women, standing near the station, their faces blurred by time. The pocket watch was rusted, its hands frozen at midnight. But it was the diary that drew our attention. Eric opened it, flipping through pages filled with shaky handwriting. The entries were short, disjointed, and written in a mix of English and another language I didn't recognize. One entry caught my eye. "The tapping won't stop. It's in the walls. It's in the floor." I told them not to dig, but they didn't listen. "Now it's awake, and it's angry." "What does that even mean?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. Eric shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but it's not good." As we read, the station seemed to come alive around us. The faint tapping returned, echoing from somewhere deep within the walls. This time, it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thudding, like a distant heartbeat. "Do you hear that?" Eric whispered, his eyes darting around the room. I nodded, my throat dry. The sound was growing louder, more insistent. We decided to explore further, moving cautiously through the station. In one of the back rooms, we found a hatch partially hidden under a rotting rug. The edges were scratched and worn, as if someone or something had tried to claw it open. Eric hesitated before pulling it up. The hinges groaned, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Are we seriously going down there?" I asked, every instinct screaming at me to stop. "We have to," Eric said, his voice grim. The descent was slow, the stairs creaking under our weight. The air grew colder with each step, the faint scent of decay growing stronger. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped tunnel lined with stone walls. The tapping was louder here, reverberating off the walls like an unnatural metronome. "What is this place?" Eric muttered, his flashlight revealing more of the tunnel. The walls were etched with strange symbols, their meaning incomprehensible. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. We moved forward, the tunnel winding deeper into the earth. The tapping was joined by whispers again, faint and indistinct. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, plunging us into brief darkness. When it came back on, Eric froze. "What?" I asked, my heart racing. "Look," he said, pointing at the ground. There, in the dirt, were footprints. They weren't ours. The prints were large, clawed, and led further down the tunnel. "Let's go back," I said, panic rising in my chest. But Eric shook his head. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood a large, circular pit, its edges lined with the same symbols we'd seen earlier. The tapping was deafening now, coming from within the pit. Eric approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the void. "What do you see?" I asked, staying several steps behind. Before he could answer, a gust of icy wind swept through the cavern, extinguishing the flashlight. We were plunged into total darkness. Then came the voice. Low, guttural, and filled with malice, it echoed through the cavern. "You should not be here." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I grabbed Eric's arm. "We need to leave, now." But the ground beneath us began to tremble, and the pit seemed to pulse, a faint red glow emanating from its depths. Eric stumbled back, his face pale. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. My mind was racing, and my only thought was survival. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the pit, its form obscured by the red glow. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were elongated, its movements jerky, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. We ran, back through the tunnel, up the stairs, and out of the station. The tapping and whispers followed us, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the station. By the time we reached the car, we were gasping for air, our faces pale and our hands trembling. Neither of us spoke as Eric drove away, the station disappearing into the darkness behind us. But the silence didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a warning. Something had been disturbed, something that wasn't meant to be found. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The morning after our escape from Redwood Station, my body felt heavy with exhaustion, but my mind refused to rest. I replayed the events of the night, Eric's shaky flashlight beam illuminating the horrifying figure that had emerged from the pit, the guttural voice that warned us, and the oppressive tapping that seemed to echo in my skull even now. Eric called just after dawn. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hollow and strained. "Eric, I don't think I can," I began, but he interrupted. "You saw it too, whatever that was, and it's not done with us." There was a finality in his tone that I couldn't ignore. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. We convened at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Eric looked worse than I'd ever seen him, pale, disheveled, and perpetually glancing over his shoulder. He spread the diary we'd taken from the station across the table, its yellowed pages seeming to radiate unease. "I've been going through this," he said, tapping an entry. "And I think I figured out some of it." The entry he pointed to was scrawled more chaotically than the others. "The seals are weakening. The digging disturbed it. We've tried to contain it, but it's only a matter of time. If anyone finds this, don't go near the pit." "What are you saying?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "I'm saying whatever's in that pit wasn't human, and it's been waiting." The thought made my skin crawl. "And now?" I whispered. "I think we woke it up," he said grimly. The sense of dread followed us as we decided to return to the station one last time. The drive there was agonizingly silent, the road winding like a black ribbon into the forest. The closer we got, the heavier the air seemed, as if the very world were conspiring to warn us away. When we reached the station, the atmosphere was palpable. The building seemed to loom larger than before, its cracked windows like empty eyes. The faint tapping had returned, audible even from the car. "We stick together this time," Eric said firmly, gripping the crowbar like a lifeline. We stepped inside, the floorboards groaning underfoot. The tapping was louder now, echoing with a rhythmic insistence that made my teeth ache. As we descended the stairs to the tunnel, the air grew colder with every step. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the tapping. When we reached the cavern, the pit was different. The red glow was stronger, pulsating like a heartbeat. The symbols etched into its edges now shimmered, alive with some kind of energy. And then it happened. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, a void that pressed against my ears. Then the voice returned, low and guttural, reverberating through the cavern. "You were warned. The ground beneath us shook violently, and the pit erupted with a blinding light. Eric and I stumbled back, shielding our eyes. When the light faded, the figure from before had returned. Only this time, it was fully formed. The creature was impossibly tall, its elongated limbs ending in sharp, claw-like appendages. Its skin was dark and glistening, as if coated in oil, and its eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. Eric raised the crowbar, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnervingly jerky. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," it said, its voice an otherworldly mix of tones. The cavern seemed to pulse with its presence, the air thick and oppressive. I could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were peeling back layers of my mind. "What do you want?" I forced out, my voice barely audible. It stepped closer, its movements fluid and predatory. "You disturbed the seal. You must pay the price." Eric swung the crowbar, a desperate, instinctual act. The metal connected with the creature's arm, but instead of recoiling, it seemed to absorb the blow. The crowbar disintegrated in Eric's hands, leaving him staring in shock. The creature raised a clawed hand, and Eric was lifted off the ground, his body suspended as if by invisible strings. He thrashed and shouted, but it was futile. "Let him go," I screamed, stepping forward. The creature's eyes shifted to me, and for a moment I felt as though my very soul was laid bare. "You wish to take his place?" it asked, its voice almost mocking. "No," Eric shouted, his voice strained. "Don't." Before I could answer, the cavern trembled again, and the symbols around the pit flared to life. The creature dropped Eric, who crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. It turned back to the pit, its attention seemingly drawn by something deeper within. The glow intensified, and a sound like distant thunder filled the space. "This is not the end," the creature said, its voice echoing. "You have only delayed the inevitable." With that, it stepped back into the pit, disappearing into the light. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Eric and I stared at each other, our faces pale and drawn. What just happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. Eric shook his head, his expression hollow. "I don't know, but I don't think it's over." We staggered out of the station, the tapping gone, but the sense of dread lingering. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time. The station stood there, silent and foreboding, as if waiting for the next unfortunate souls to stumble upon it. Eric and I didn't speak on the drive home. There were no words for what we'd seen, no way to explain the horrors we'd unleashed. But deep down, I knew one thing. We had crossed a line, disturbed something ancient and powerful. And it wasn't done with us yet. The drive back from Redwood Station was suffocating. The silence between Eric and me was as thick as the fog that had crept into the night. Every creak of the car and shift of the forest around us felt like a warning, a reminder that we had witnessed something that defied comprehension. Eric was the first to speak, his voice raw and hesitant. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said. "Who would believe us?" I nodded, unable to argue. Even if we tried to explain, the story sounded ludicrous, like something out of a fever dream. And yet, the weight of it pressed on us what we'd seen, what we'd unleashed, and the creature's haunting words. This is not the end. We reached Eric's place just as the sun began to rise. The warm hues of dawn felt alien, almost mocking, as if the world had no idea what lay beneath its surface. Eric parked the car, and we sat there for a moment, neither of us moving. "What now?" I finally asked. Eric shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We forget. We stay away from that place, and we forget." But I couldn't forget. Not the glowing symbols, not the creature's piercing gaze, and certainly not the sense that we had tampered with something far beyond our understanding. In the days that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least, it tried to. I went back to work, plastering on a facade of calm, but inside, I was a mess. Every shadow felt too long, every silence too loud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something from that night had followed me home. Eric and I stopped speaking as frequently. The shared trauma of that night became a wedge between us, a reminder of the horrors we wanted to bury. When we did talk, it was brief and strained, the unspoken agreement to never mention Redwood Station hanging heavy in the air. A week after our encounter, I noticed something strange. It started with small things, keys that weren't where I'd left them, lights flickering in my apartment, the faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, the lingering effects of our experience. But then, it escalated. One night, I woke up to find my room bathed in a faint red glow. The tapping was louder now, insistent and rhythmic. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the room for the source. And then I saw it as symbol, faint but unmistakable, etched into the ceiling above my bed. It was one of the symbols from the cavern. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone to call Eric. He answered after the third ring, his voice groggy and irritated. "Do you see it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "See what?" he asked, but before I could answer, he froze. "Wait, you hear it too, don't you?" The tapping. It was there, faint but unmistakable, coming through the phone. Eric showed up at my place within the hour, his face pale and drawn. He carried a duffel bag, and I caught a glimpse of a flashlight, rope, and other tools inside. "We need to go back," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Are you insane?" I shot back. "Why would we go back there?" "Because it's not just going to leave us alone," he said. "You've seen the signs. It's getting stronger, and if we don't do something, I think it's going to come for us." As much as I wanted to deny it, he was right. The tapping, the symbols, the sense of being watched, it all pointed to one thing. We had opened a door that we couldn't close, and now it was following us. We returned to Redwood Station that night, our fear outweighed only by our desperation. The drive there was eerily similar to the last time, silent and tense, the forest pressing in on us like a living thing. The station looked the same as before, but now it felt more alive. The air was charged, and the tapping was audible even from outside. We go in, we try to figure out what it wants, and we leave, Eric said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. We descended into the tunnels, the familiar chill wrapping around us like a shroud. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. When we reached the cavern, the pit was still. The red glow was dimmer now, but the sense of presence was stronger than ever. "What do we do?" I whispered. Eric didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, pulling the diary from his bag. He flipped to the last entry, his eyes scanning the page. "It's a warning," he said finally, "about the seal. It says the only way to contain it is to..." His words were cut off as the pit erupted with light, the same blinding glow as before. The creature emerged again, its form more solid, more menacing. "You return," it said, its voice resonating through the cavern. "Why?" Eric held up the diary. "We're here to fix it," he said, his voice shaking. "To put the seal back." The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can undo what has been done? Foolish." The cavern began to shake, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter. Eric dropped the diary and grabbed my arm. "Run!" he shouted. We bolted up the tunnel, the creature's voice echoing behind us. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if the station itself were alive. When we reached the surface, the air was thick and heavy, pressing down on us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, collapsing into the seats and slamming the doors shut. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The station was gone, replaced by an empty clearing. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Eric said, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "But I think it's over." In the weeks that followed, the signs stopped. The tapping disappeared, the symbols faded, and the sense of being watched lifted. Eric and I drifted apart, the weight of our shared experience too much to bear. I never went back to Redwood Station, and I never saw the creature again. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the faintest tap, tap, tap in the distance, as if reminding me that it's still out there, waiting. It's been months since that night at Redwood Station, and the memory of it still lingers in the corners of my mind, like a dark stain that refuses to wash away. I've tried to move on, to bury it beneath the weight of my daily life, but it's never quite gone. Sometimes, when the air grows heavy with silence, or when I find myself in an unfamiliar place, I can still hear it, the faint, rhythmic tapping. The same sound that had followed us through the tunnels, the sound that seemed to be both a warning and a curse. I've tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, that the creature, the symbols, the overwhelming sense of dread were nothing more than the product of our own fear. But the truth is, something happened that night. Something that I can't explain away. I've gone back to my routine. I wake up, go to work, meet with friends, and pretend like everything is normal. But normality, in its full sense, has eluded me. The world feels different now, slightly askew, like the horizon is a little bit off, and no matter how much I focus, I can't quite put things back in place. Eric and I no longer talk much. There's an unspoken understanding between us that whatever happened that night, it's not something we're willing to revisit. But sometimes I catch him at odd moments, his eyes distant, his gaze shifting towards some faraway place, and I wonder if he too feels the weight of it. As for Redwood Station, it remains a forbidden place. I can't bring myself to drive out there again, even though I've considered it. I wonder if the creature still lingers, waiting for someone else to stumble upon the forgotten station. Or worse, waiting for me to return and finish what we started. The town surrounding Redwood Station has since fallen into a sort of quiet oblivion. The local authorities never acknowledge the strange occurrences, and there are no reports of any unusual activity. The station itself remains abandoned, forgotten by most of the world, a relic of time that no one bothers to remember. But I know better. I've seen its true nature, its dark pulse that beats beneath the surface, and I can't shake the thought that the station is more than just a decaying building. It's a doorway, a gateway to something beyond our understanding. And whether or not we wanted to, Eric and I opened it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder if there's more to the story, more that we still don't understand. Did we really stop it, or did we merely delay the inevitable? I think about the creature and its words, how it had said, "You return." Why? What did it mean by that? Did it know that we'd come back? Or was it trying to communicate something deeper? Something we missed in the chaos of that night? I wonder if Eric has any answers, but I'm too afraid to ask. There's something about that place, about the creature, that feels like a riddle, one that doesn't have a solution. It's a truth that we weren't meant to know. Life, as it often does, moves on. Time dulls the edges of the memory, and I've almost forgotten what it felt like to be trapped in that nightmare. But the truth still lingers in the back of my mind, and I can't help but wonder, what if the things we don't understand are far more real than we want to believe? And what if, just maybe, there are more forgotten places out there, hidden in the corners of the world, waiting to reveal their secrets? Waiting for the next person to stumble across them? I've become more cautious in my steps, more aware of the shadows that seem to follow me, always just out of reach. I don't know if I'll ever truly shake the feeling that Redwood Station wasn't the end of the story. But then again, maybe some stories are never meant to be finished. And maybe, just maybe, it's better to leave them forgotten. As I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the thought that someone, somewhere, will find this account my story and think that they're safe. That the things I've written, the things I've warned about, are nothing more than the ramblings of a frightened man. But I know the truth. I've seen the things that others refuse to acknowledge. I've stepped into a world where the rules we live by don't apply. So if you find yourself drawn to forgotten places, to abandoned stations and long-forgotten paths, I beg you, tread carefully. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some things are waiting for the right moment to return. Take this as a warning, because in the end, no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to forget, the past has a way of catching up with you. And when it does, it might be too late to escape. It was the kind of summer evening that felt normal, almost too normal. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted with hues of dark purple and fiery orange. My friends and I were spending the last few weeks of vacation together, savoring the last bit of freedom before we all went our separate ways. We didn't have any particular plans for the evening, just the usual group hangout, driving around aimlessly, stopping at a local diner, and seeing where the night would take us. There were 5 of us in total. Me, along with 3 others, and then there was Nathan. Nathan was the one who suggested we go check out the old amusement park. He had been talking about it for weeks, ever since he'd found out it had been abandoned for over a decade. He was the type who always had a fascination with forgotten places, with history left to decay. I, on the other hand, wasn't exactly thrilled at the idea, but it was Nathan, and everyone else was on board, so I reluctantly agreed. The park was located just outside the city, tucked away behind a thick line of trees that gave it a sense of isolation. From the road, it looked like a shadow of what it once was: faded signs, rusted gates, and a tall, broken Ferris wheel that creaked in the wind like a ghost. The gates had been locked for years, but there was a spot where the rusted iron fence had been bent enough for someone to slip through. Nathan was the first to crawl through, followed by the rest of us. We weren't out there for any particular reason, just curiosity. The whole place had an eerie reputation, mostly because it was said to be cursed. Stories about the park's closure had circulated for years. Rumors of strange disappearances, strange noises late at night, and of course, the unsettling tales that had grown over time. But we weren't scared, or at least, not at first. The first thing that hit us was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of any noise at all. No rustling of trees in the wind, no distant traffic hum from the city, not even the usual sound of insects. It was as if the entire world outside this forgotten place had ceased to exist. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and old metal. It felt like we had stepped into a time capsule frozen in time, preserved for reasons unknown. The park stretched out before us, an odd maze of derelict attractions. There was a carousel, its painted horses chipped and faded, their once bright colors now ghostly and dull. The bumper car rink had long since fallen into disrepair, with rusting cars piled up in the center. There was a small roller coaster, its tracks warped and twisted by years of neglect. And then there was the Ferris wheel, towering over everything else, the great wheel that used to carry families high into the sky. We walked deeper into the park, the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel, the only noise breaking the eerie stillness. Nathan was leading the way, his curiosity pushing him forward as he ran his hand along the cracked wooden beams of the carousel. We were all taking it in, fascinated by the decay. It was strange, yes, but also oddly captivating. It didn't feel like we were in danger, not yet. As we walked, we passed the old ticket booths, their windows boarded up and covered in grime. The graffiti on the walls was faded, but it told a story, one of rebellion, defiance, and perhaps even desperation. The place felt like it had been abandoned, not just by people, but by time itself. But there was one thing I couldn't shake off, the feeling that we weren't alone. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shift in the shadows that didn't quite make sense. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, that the stillness and the decay were messing with my head. After all, we were 5 friends, all in our early 20s, with our minds on the mundane school, work, life. There was no reason to be afraid. We walked toward the heart of the park, the place where the most significant attraction used to be, the funhouse. It stood in front of us, a hulking structure with a twisted, grimacing face carved into the facade. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges like a broken jaw. Nathan pushed the door open with a creak, a sound that echoed through the empty space inside. "Let's check it out," Nathan said, his voice almost too casual, too eager. I hesitated, but before I could say anything, he was already inside, disappearing into the darkness. Reluctantly, we followed him. The inside of the funhouse was colder than the outside air, and the musty scent of mold filled our noses as we moved deeper into the darkness. The walls were covered in warped mirrors, each one reflecting distorted versions of ourselves, making our movements look unnatural. My heart rate picked up as I stepped further into the gloom, and I had to force myself to breathe deeply to stay calm. There were more strange things in here than I could have expected. But it wasn't the appearance of the funhouse that unsettled me, it was the way it felt. The air was thicker here, heavy with an energy I couldn't place. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint scraping sounds from somewhere far off in the dark, but when I turned around, nothing was there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to the others, but they were too focused on the strange mirrors and peeling wallpaper to pay attention. Nathan, as usual, was already moving ahead, determined to explore every corner of the place. I lingered in the back, my unease growing with every step. The mirrors reflected my every movement, but something was off. There was a figure in one of the mirrors, standing behind me. When I turned around, no one was there. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the trick of the mirrors. After all, this was a place designed to mess with your head. But as I walked past the reflection again, the figure was there, clearer this time, tall, pale, and with eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if I should call out, if I should tell Nathan, but something told me that this wasn't just some illusion. The figure in the mirror was real, and it was watching me. The air grew even colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The unease I had been trying to ignore had turned into full-blown fear. I wanted to leave, but the others were still absorbed in their exploration. That's when the first sign of something truly unsettling happened. The mirrors, which had once been silent, started to creak. It wasn't just the reflection I was seeing, it was something else, something shifting behind the glass. Something moving. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. That was when the first real terror struck. As the darkness enveloped us, a sudden chill swept through the funhouse, more intense than the usual night air. I could hear my friends' breaths quicken, their footsteps hesitant as the space seemed to close in around us. The faint sounds of rustling and shifting from earlier had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. My heart raced, the eerie silence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed through the hall, coming from the direction of the old mirrors. It was a heavy, thunderous sound, like a door slamming shut, and it seemed to shake the walls themselves. I froze, my blood turning cold in my veins. The others were startled too, their heads snapping in the direction of the noise. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What the hell was that?" Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible, but tinged with the same unease I was feeling. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing except the mirrors, the broken lights, and the shadows that stretched unnaturally in the dim light. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror in front of me. For a split second, I thought I saw movement behind the glass. Just a flicker of something tall and dark, but it was gone before I could even process it. The others didn't seem to notice. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn something had been standing behind the reflection of myself. I wasn't sure how to explain it, and I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept quiet. But my body was on edge, and every muscle was tense, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Then, one of the mirrors, the largest one, suddenly cracked. The sound was sharp, like a stone being thrown into glass, and the crack spread from one corner of the mirror to the other in an instant. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my ribcage. The others noticed this, and their faces twisted in confusion and alarm. "Did you see that?" one of them asked, pointing at the mirror. His voice was loud, and it broke the silence, but it felt out of place here. "Yeah, I saw it," Nathan said, his tone tinged with curiosity, but also uncertainty. He stepped closer to the broken mirror, leaning in as though he was trying to figure out if it was real. "Must be some old glass. It's probably just." Before he could finish, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker, they went out entirely, plunging us into complete darkness. I could hear the others gasping, the sound of their footsteps shuffling as they stumbled to find each other. "Shit," I muttered, instinctively reaching for my phone. I turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the broken mirror. The crack in the glass had grown, and now the reflection looked distorted, almost warped. The edges of the crack twisted in unnatural ways, as though the glass itself was alive. I could hear the others whispering now, their voices strained with fear. "What the hell is going on?" one of them asked, his voice barely audible in the heavy silence. "We should leave," I said, my voice louder than I intended. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. This place is giving me the creeps. But Nathan, ever the adventurer, wasn't ready to leave. "It's just a broken mirror, man. No reason to freak out," he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as before. "Let's just keep going. We're almost through the funhouse." I looked around at the others, their faces pale in the dim light, their eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. They all seemed to be considering Nathan's words, but none of them spoke up immediately. Instead, there was an unsettling silence, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first move. Despite my fear, I didn't want to be the one to turn back. I didn't want to seem like the scared one. So I followed Nathan as he moved deeper into the funhouse, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark in front of me. My mind raced, the images of the cracked mirror and the strange shadow I'd seen flashing through my thoughts, but I pushed them aside, telling myself it was just the atmosphere playing tricks on me. The air in the room seemed heavier now, thick with something I couldn't place. The silence, which had been unsettling before, now felt suffocating. We moved past more mirrors, some of them shattered, some cracked, some barely hanging on by a single screw. But it wasn't the broken mirrors that caught my attention. It was the feeling, the growing sense that something was just beyond the edges of my vision, something that wasn't quite right. Suddenly, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. A soft, scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across glass. It seemed to come from the far side of the room, and I could hear it grow louder with every passing second. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the noise, but there was nothing, just the darkness, the broken mirrors, and the creeping sensation that we were not alone. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I held the flashlight out in front of me, but nothing appeared in the beam. The others stopped in their tracks, looking around nervously. Nathan, still the brave one, took a step toward the sound, his eyes scanning the space like he was searching for a rational explanation. "Probably just some rats or something," he said, though his voice was shaky now too. "Old place like this, it's bound to have some creatures living in it." But I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't feel like an animal scurrying about. It was something else, something deliberate. And then I saw it again, that fleeting shadow. It passed just behind one of the mirrors, but this time it wasn't just a flicker. It was there long enough for me to recognize it, a tall, dark figure, moving against the light, not in any way that a person should move. The figure didn't have the shape of a man, nor the grace of something alive. Before I could react, the lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The darkness in the funhouse felt alive, pressing in from all sides. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I could hear the others breathing, their steps erratic as they moved closer to one another. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness lifted. The lights flickered back on, weak but steady, revealing the broken mirrors, the peeling walls, and the dusty floor. But something had changed. The figure, the shadow, was gone. We stood in stunned silence for a moment, unsure of what to say. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands still trembling from the fear that had gripped me just moments ago. The room, now bathed in harsh fluorescent light, felt less suffocating, but the unease lingered. What the hell was that? One of the others finally asked, his voice trembling. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as we all exchanged nervous glances. None of us said anything for a while. We stood there, silently processing what had just happened. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Had we seen something real? Or had it all been our minds playing tricks on us, amplified by the isolation and decay of this forgotten place? Whatever it was, I knew one thing. We needed to get out of here. But Nathan wasn't ready to give up just yet. We all stood there in the middle of the funhouse, the stillness now thick in the air. The flickering lights above our heads did little to ease the growing sense of dread that had settled into the pit of my stomach. The mirror shards glittered ominously on the floor, and the low hum of the old electric lights echoed around the vast, empty space, amplifying the silence. But despite the strange occurrences, Nathan was the first to break the tension. "We can't just stand here," he said, his voice low but firm. "This place is old. Maybe it's just settling or whatever. We keep moving. We're almost through. Let's just get to the exit." I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that we were missing something crucial. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but Nathan's words kept me from turning around and running out the door. We'd come this far, and I wasn't about to be the one to back down. The others looked hesitant, their eyes flickering nervously between the broken mirrors, the crumbling walls, and each other. No one said anything, but I could see it on their faces, the unease, the uncertainty. They didn't want to seem scared either, but fear was starting to seep into the cracks of their facade. We began to walk again, cautiously this time, but our steps were slower, more deliberate. My eyes darted from corner to corner, trying to make sense of what was going on. But all I saw was the same dark, twisted world reflected in the mirrors around us, distorted faces and broken glass, the remnants of a forgotten era. As we moved deeper into the heart of the funhouse, the sense of something watching us grew stronger. The air was colder now, biting at my skin as we walked past more shattered mirrors and rusted metal. There was a constant, faint scraping sound now, like metal dragging across stone, or maybe fingernails across the surface of something far darker. It came and went, ebbing and flowing, and it felt like it was getting closer. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, halting in my tracks. The scraping had intensified, and it was unmistakably louder. It wasn't just the sound of the building settling, it was something else, something deliberate, something that wasn't part of the old, decaying structure around us. "Yeah, I heard it," Nathan said, his voice strained. "It's probably just the wind or something. We're in an old building. Let's keep moving." But his words lacked conviction, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the nervous glance he cast over his shoulder. It wasn't just the sound, though. The air felt heavier now, thick with something that wasn't just decay. The temperature had dropped sharply. My breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight, and I could see the others exhaling in shallow puffs. It wasn't just cold, it was unnaturally cold, like the temperature had plummeted without any explanation. Suddenly, the lights above us flickered once more, and this time, they didn't return to full brightness. Instead, they sputtered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The space around us seemed to stretch and distort, the shadows shifting unnaturally, as if they were alive, moving independently of the objects they clung to. "What's going on with the lights?" one of the others muttered, his voice low and anxious. He wasn't wrong. The lights weren't acting like any normal flickering. It was as though something was interfering with them, something beyond the normal wear and tear of an abandoned amusement park. The sense of something or someone being close intensified. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn around and run, but we were so deep inside now. The exit felt so far away, And part of me, despite the fear that gnawed at me, wanted to see this through. Nathan stepped forward, his hand reaching for the next corner. "Come on, just a little further," he urged, but even his voice was tight with uncertainty now. As he moved, I noticed something strange. The mirror nearest him, which had been whole when we walked past it, suddenly cracked with a loud snap, the sound like a whip cracking through the air. The cracks ran along its surface, the jagged lines seeming to move, as if they were spreading of their own accord. Everyone stopped, staring at the mirror in disbelief. "What the hell?" one of the others whispered. I didn't need to say anything. We all knew something wasn't right. The place wasn't just falling apart, it was responding to us, reacting to our presence. The mirror didn't look like it was decaying. Something else was happening, something far more sinister. We backed away from the mirror slowly, but then something caught my eye. In the reflection, just beyond the broken glass, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just the angle, the shadows playing tricks. But when I focused, I realized that the reflection wasn't exactly the same as what was in front of me. The mirror was showing something different, a figure, tall and thin, moving just behind us, its features twisted and blurred. "Did you see that?" I blurted out, pointing at the mirror. The others looked, but before they could react, the figure vanished, slipping away as though it had never been there at all. "What the hell was that?" one of the others asked, his voice trembling now. It was no longer just fear, it was something deeper, something primal that was creeping into all of us. "I don't know," I said, swallowing hard, "but we need to get out of here. Now." But Nathan didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the broken mirror, as if caught in a trance. He wasn't even responding to us anymore. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, as though he was seeing something we couldn't. "Nathan?" I asked, taking a step toward him. My voice was shaky, my body tense. He didn't move. And then, without warning, the room shook. It wasn't a small tremor, it was a violent jolt, as though something massive had just shifted beneath us. The floor cracked, and the lights flickered out again, this time plunging us into total darkness. My flashlight flickered, and I barely caught a glimpse of Nathan's silhouette before the beam went out completely. We stood in total silence for a moment. My heart raced in the darkness, the cold tightening around me. I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the occasional shuffling of footsteps as the others moved closer to one another. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the light flickered back on, but it wasn't the same. The beam cut through the darkness, but now it illuminated something different. The mirrors, the walls, they were all warped, distorted, as though the entire space had been twisted, reshaped by some unseen force. "Guys," I said, my voice cracking. "What the hell happened?" The mirrors were no longer just reflections of ourselves. They were showing us something else, something more disturbing. They revealed grotesque shapes, distorted faces, twisted figures that didn't belong. They moved within the reflections, their bodies jerking unnaturally, as though they were trying to break free from the glass. I could feel the others' panic rising as they backed away from the mirrors, their faces twisted with fear and disbelief. "I told you we should have left," I whispered, though it felt useless now. The horror was real, and whatever was here, whatever we had disturbed, wasn't going to let us leave easily. The temperature dropped again, colder now than it had been before, until it felt like we were standing in the heart of winter itself. My breath came out in ragged puffs, and the cold seeped into my bones, making it harder to think clearly. We had to get out. But the exit, the path we had come from, was now blocked. The mirrors were closing in on us, shifting, their reflections growing more twisted with every passing second. The way out was gone. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. That shadow, tall, dark, and moving toward us. This time, it wasn't in the reflection. It was right there, in the room with us. The shadow grew closer, inch by inch, its form becoming more defined in the flickering light. I could see it now, a figure, tall and gaunt, moving unnaturally toward us. The others were frozen in place, their faces pale, their mouths slightly agape as they stared at the thing that was slowly advancing. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The air was thick with fear, with something dark and malevolent that was suffocating us. My heart pounded in my chest so violently I could barely hear my own thoughts. The cold that had settled in the room was like a vice, crushing the life from my lungs with every shallow breath I took. Nathan, who had been silent this entire time, now moved. His face was no longer that of the confident leader, the one who insisted we press on. It was a mask of terror, and his eyes, wide and glassy, locked on the figure in front of him. "Nathan," I shouted, taking a step forward, trying to snap him out of it. But my voice sounded distant, like I was underwater. There was no response. It was like he didn't hear me at all. The figure was nearly upon us now. It stood in the dim light, its face obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know that whatever it wasn't human. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were like black holes, deep and endless, absorbing the little light that made it through the darkness. It was as though the very presence of this thing was warping reality. The air felt thick, like it was made of something heavier than just molecules. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, and I felt like I was swaying, like the world itself was moving, but only in one direction, the direction of the shadow. My instincts screamed at me to run, to flee, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. I watched, helpless, as the figure drew closer, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating with each step. Suddenly, the lights above flickered one last time before they died completely, plunging us into darkness. I heard a gasp, followed by frantic whispers, but I couldn't make out any words. The silence was more profound now, more suffocating than ever. Then came the voice. A low, guttural sound, like something ancient, something that had never been human. It was at once distant and right next to my ear, filling my mind with a sense of dread so deep I thought I would collapse under its weight. "You should have left," the voice growled. It was like the wind, like 1,000 whispers, but somehow louder, more forceful. My blood ran cold. The figure wasn't just a thing, it was aware of us. It had been watching, waiting for us to come closer. And now, we were trapped. I could feel the other's presence behind me, Nathan, completely frozen in place, as though the fear had completely overtaken him. The others were huddled together, their breathing shallow, but none of us could move. We're stuck," one of the others whispered, the panic in his voice rising. His words broke the spell for a moment, and we all seemed to snap back to reality. But it was too late. The fear had already taken hold. Suddenly, Nathan moved. He wasn't walking. He was stumbling, jerking as though his body wasn't responding to his commands. His eyes were glazed over, distant, and then, without warning, he lunged toward the figure, arms outstretched like he was trying to embrace it. "No, Nathan," I yelled, trying to grab him, but it was too late. His hands were already reaching for the shadow. I felt the world go silent again. No one moved. No one spoke. The shadows seemed to close in, thickening, pulsing. The figure, still just a silhouette against the void, reached out, its hand its claw grasping Nathan's outstretched arm. The moment their hands met, the air seemed to explode with sound, a deafening, hollow crack that rattled my bones. Nathan screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of something far worse, a scream that rattled my very soul. His body jerked violently, and then he was yanked away, pulled into the shadow like a ragdoll, his scream fading into the darkness. I felt a surge of panic, of desperation, and in a blind moment of horror, I ran. I didn't even know where I was going, just away, anywhere that wasn't here, that wasn't in the grasp of whatever nightmare we had disturbed. I heard footsteps behind me, someone else was running too, but I didn't dare look back. The darkness behind me seemed to grow, to follow, to call me back into its depths. I rounded the corner of the hall, my feet slipping on the cracked, uneven floor. I could hear the others, their frantic footsteps just behind me, but their presence felt so distant, so unreachable. Then, the air shifted again, and I felt the temperature drop even further, colder than it had ever been. A chill so intense that my body began to numb. My breath came out in clouds of frozen air, and I could see my own shaking hands in front of me, white-knuckled and desperate. I stopped in my tracks. The hallway stretched ahead of me, but now it looked different, distorted, bent in ways it hadn't been before. The walls seemed to pulse, the faintest shimmer of movement against them, as if something was watching us, something that wasn't quite visible, but was everywhere, in everything. And there, in the distance, I saw him. Nathan. But it wasn't him. Not anymore. His body was there, but his face was wrong. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes, those black, endless eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a spike of terror straight through my chest. He opened his mouth, but the words that came out weren't his. They weren't even words. They were more like a command, a low, guttural growl, something ancient and old, a voice that wasn't Nathan's, but something that had taken him. Leave, before it takes you too. And then, before I could move, the floor beneath me buckled. The walls groaned, and the shadows around me closed in tighter. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was Nathan's outstretched arm reaching for me, dragging me back into the void. I awoke to silence. The air was still, the kind of stillness that settles into your bones and clings to your skin. My body felt heavy, as though I'd been lying there for hours, days, maybe. But when I opened my eyes, I could see nothing had changed. The same old corridor stretched before me, now eerily quiet. The dim light from the flickering bulb overhead cast long shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of the figure, no trace of Nathan. Just darkness and dust. I sat up slowly, my limbs stiff and aching. My mind was a fog of confusion, panic, and exhaustion, but the silence around me was even more unsettling. It was too quiet, too unnatural. Had it all been a dream? I rubbed my eyes and stood, my head spinning. I needed to get out of there. We had to leave before whatever nightmare we disturbed came for us too. But the question hung over me like a weight. What had really happened to Nathan? Was any of us safe? I staggered down the hallway, each step feeling like a betrayal of my own sanity. I was trying to remember how many turns I had made, how many corridors I had passed, but the layout of the place was completely unfamiliar. The amusement park had always been a labyrinth, and now, in the midst of the nightmare, it felt like I had wandered into a completely different world. Every corner seemed to hold something waiting to trap me, and every room seemed to be haunted by the faintest remnants of what had come before. As I rounded another bend in the hall, I saw them. The others. We were all drawn together again in the same place. I could hear their voices before I saw them, low, murmured conversations, almost like they were too afraid to speak too loudly, as if they feared drawing attention to themselves. They were huddled together in a small, tight-knit group, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the same terror I had felt earlier. And yet, no one spoke at first. We just stood there, taking each other in, as though we were all unsure whether the others were really real. "Where's Nathan?" I asked, my voice weak. The words felt like they came from somewhere deep inside me, buried under the weight of everything I had just witnessed. It wasn't like the question was new. I had been asking it in my mind for what felt like an eternity, but now it hung in the air, thick and heavy. No one answered immediately. One of the others, Jason, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "We couldn't find him," he said, his eyes darting to the ground. I don't know where he went." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat choking the words. He didn't make it, did he?" Jason looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't need to hear the answer. We all knew it, deep down. Nathan was gone. Whatever had taken him had dragged him beyond the reach of our help, beyond the reach of anything we could do. The others stayed quiet, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. No one was ready to face the truth, not yet. But we couldn't stay here forever. "Do you remember the way out?" I asked, breaking the silence. We have to go, now. Jason nodded, his eyes distant, but there was something in his gaze that told me he wasn't sure. The others looked at each other, then back at me, as if they were all thinking the same thing. What was waiting for us out there? What was on the other side of the park? Could we really leave, knowing what we had seen, what had happened? Can we even escape this place? One of them asked, his voice cracking. It was a question that hung in the air, and none of us had an answer. None of us knew how we had gotten here, or how to get out. I didn't know what to say. My mind was still a whirlwind of questions, unanswered and unanswerable. But we couldn't stay here. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever had taken Nathan, it was still here. It was still waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it had us all. With a shared glance, we began moving forward, slowly at first, but then faster as we passed through the corridors and tunnels. We retraced our steps the best we could, though the place seemed to shift, like it was playing tricks on us. The doors that should have led us back to the outside were locked or sealed, and the walls seemed to stretch and contort, like the very structure of the park itself was resisting our escape. Every shadow felt like it was alive, watching us, and every sound felt amplified. The rustling of our footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, even the beating of our hearts, it was all deafening in the silence. But the silence didn't last. We began to hear things. Voices. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A whisper here, a low murmur there. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but as we moved through the park, the voices grew louder. They were everywhere, surrounding us, like the very air was filled with them. They were soft at first, but the closer we got to the main gates, the clearer they became. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, teasing. Suddenly, there was a sound louder now, like a door slamming shut. We froze, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "There's someone here," one of the others whispered, barely audible, but I could feel the fear in their voice. We were close now, so close to the exit. The gates were in sight, just a few more steps, and we'd be out. But then, just as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered one last time. The voices stopped. The shadows seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped. The gates were locked. My heart sank. We were trapped. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my hands against the gates, desperate to get out. But no matter how hard I pulled or how much I screamed, the gates wouldn't open. The voices, those mocking whispers, began to swirl around us again. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. That figure. It was back. It had followed us. We couldn't escape. It felt as though the ground beneath my feet had dissolved, leaving me to drift in a space between reality and something far worse. The figure was standing just beyond the gates now, its presence more imposing than ever. It moved, but not in any way that was natural. It was fluid, an unsettling distortion in the air, like it was more of a shadow than a person, just an outline of something that should not exist. The voices returned, louder now, like 100 whispers scraping against the edges of my sanity. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt their weight pressing against me. I could feel my heartbeat racing in my chest, suffocating me. Fear surged through me like electricity, making my muscles seize up, making me unable to look away. Behind me, the others were frozen, just as trapped as I was. We were surrounded by something that we didn't understand, something that had followed us from the very beginning. We had disturbed something ancient, something that didn't belong here, and now it had us. It had claimed its victims, and we were the last ones left. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel it. The air was thicker now, heavier with something oppressive. The darkness seemed to close in, the very walls of the abandoned amusement park pushing toward us. It was as if the park itself was alive, breathing, suffocating us in its grip. And then, something unexpected happened. The gates, they opened. It was as though the park had granted us one last chance. Or perhaps it had simply grown tired of us. I didn't know. But the doors creaked, and for the first time in what felt like forever, The weight in my chest lifted. The voices quieted, and the shadows receded, just enough to let us through. We didn't hesitate. We didn't need to look back. We bolted for the exit, each of us scrambling through the gates into the open air. The night outside was cold, but the feeling of freedom was even colder, like it came with a price. We didn't stop running. We didn't even look at each other. All that mattered was getting away from that place, from whatever it was that had followed us. I didn't know what had happened to Nathan. I didn't know what had happened to the others who had disappeared before us. Maybe they were still there, trapped in the darkness, part of the park's twisted memory. Maybe they were waiting for someone else to wander in, to disturb whatever slumbered in the heart of that place. But one thing was certain. We couldn't undo what we had seen. We couldn't take back what we had done by stepping into that forgotten part of the park, and we couldn't escape the images that haunted us now, the cold, empty eyes of that figure, the sound of the whispers, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't human. It had left its mark on us. The ride back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The world outside the park seemed too bright, too normal, but we knew better. We knew the darkness had followed us. It had planted its seed in our minds, and no matter how far we went, no matter how many miles we put between us and that place, it would always be with us. In the days that followed, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the memory of those voices echoing in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, just a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew what we had witnessed wasn't a dream. It was real. The park had claimed us, whether we wanted it to or not, and we would never be the same. In the years that followed, the park was forgotten again. People stopped talking about it. The old amusement park, now overrun by nature, was left to decay in peace. But I never went back. None of us did. Every so often, I would hear rumors of people going missing near the old park, of strange noises in the night, but I dismissed them. It was just the local folklore, I told myself. People had a tendency to exaggerate, especially when it came to places like that. But sometimes, when I found myself alone, the memory of that place would creep into my thoughts again. The shadows, the whispers, the eyes. I couldn't help but wonder if the park was still waiting, still pulling people in, still feeding off the fear and the memories of those who had crossed its threshold. This story begins a few years ago, back when I was just a regular guy trying to make ends meet. I was working as a security guard for a large, old building in the middle of town. It wasn't exactly the most thrilling job, but it paid the bills and kept me out of trouble. I remember the building well, tall, weathered with time, and filled with long, dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was a bit of a maze, and as the night wore on, the silence seemed to grow heavier. I was used to it. The hum of the lights, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the cold concrete floors. It became my routine, my normal. I worked the graveyard shift from midnight until 8 a.m., and at that hour, the building was empty. Well, almost empty. There were a few cleaners who worked in the early morning hours, but other than that, I had the whole place to myself. I'd patrol the premises every hour, making sure the doors were locked, the cameras were functioning, and that nothing out of the ordinary was going on. Like any security job, it was repetitive but necessary. The clock on the wall became my only real companion, marking the long hours until the end of my shift. In the beginning, I didn't mind the quiet. It was peaceful, almost comforting in its solitude. There was a certain peace in knowing the whole building was mine, at least for the night. The only real disturbances came when I had to check the security monitors or do a quick walk around to make sure everything was secure. The cold air in the hallways, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, and the distant sounds of my shoes scraping the floor were the only sounds that filled the silence. That was the way it was supposed to be. Then, one night, things began to change. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to unsettle me. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of night where the temperature never seemed to drop, even though it was well past midnight. I was making my rounds, checking the cameras in the back office, when I heard a soft, almost inaudible creak. I looked around, thinking it was just the building settling, a regular noise that happens when old structures shift under their own weight. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving in the shadows, just beyond my sight. At first, I brushed it off. Old buildings make noise, right? But the longer I stood there, staring at the empty hallways on the screen, the more I began to question it. The building was huge, and it was quiet, eerily so. The kind of quiet that gnaws at you, makes you think you can hear things you shouldn't be able to hear. I had to push those thoughts aside. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. It wasn't anything to be concerned about. The building had been here for decades, after all. It had witnessed its fair share of history, and who knows what ghosts it might carry from its past. But I didn't think much about that. It was just a building, no more, no less. And then came that first strange incident. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker of a light in the hallway. I was standing in the security office, staring at the monitors when the lights on the second floor went out. Just one of them. The hallway light, to be specific. At first, I thought it was a power issue. But when I checked the control panel, everything seemed fine. The lights were on, the power was stable. I was about to dismiss it when I heard something else this time. A faint thud from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen onto the floor. I froze. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I didn't move immediately. I stared at the screen, watching the light above the second floor hallway flicker again. It was almost as if something was toying with me. A slight pause, then a flash of light, almost like a shadow darting across the screen. For a moment, I didn't know what to make of it. My gut told me something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel it. Something was wrong. I wasn't used to this feeling. I had worked countless night shifts before, and I had never once felt like something was watching me, or worse, that something was out there, waiting. But there it was now, an unsettling sensation creeping up my spine. I stood frozen in front of the monitors for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch, maybe something was wrong with the wiring. But the building had always been solid, no history of problems like this before. Why now? Why tonight? I shook off the unease and made my way upstairs to check on things. It's funny, looking back on it now. I should have been more cautious. But at the time, I just chalked it up to another oddity in a place that was as old as time itself. I arrived at the second floor and walked down the long, narrow hallway. The lights were still flickering, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, making every step seem louder than it was. The air was thick, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I reached the end of the hallway. I stood there for a moment, listening. The building was quiet, too quiet. But then I heard it again. A faint creaking noise, like a door opening and closing. The hair on my arms prickled. I turned around, my eyes scanning the dark corners, looking for anything that could explain the strange noises. But there was nothing. No doors opening, no movement in the shadows. Just the flickering lights. The strange feeling didn't leave me, though. I had learned to trust my instincts over the years, and something was telling me that there was something more to all of this. Something I couldn't quite grasp yet. That was the beginning of it, all the first unsettling event that would haunt me for the rest of my shifts at that building. It was just the beginning, But I didn't know that then. I was still thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. But over the coming nights, I would learn that something was very wrong. Something that couldn't be explained away so easily. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary, and the noises stopped as quickly as they had started. But deep down, I knew this was just the start. Something was coming, and I had no idea how to face it. The flickering light and odd creaks from upstairs never returned, and for a while, I convinced myself that it was nothing more than a coincidence, a faulty light fixture, maybe a loose floorboard. After all, this was an old building, and buildings like that tend to settle and creak when they shift with temperature changes or the passing of time. But, as you probably guessed by now, that's not where the story ends. It was on the third night after the first odd event when things truly began to take a turn. I walked into the security office that night around 11:45 p.m. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower than usual, and I found myself fighting the urge to yawn as I settled in for my shift. Nothing unusual had happened that evening. No strange noises, no flickering lights. The building was, as always, eerily quiet. I ran through my usual routine, checking the security monitors, setting the alarms, and locking the side entrances. The usual hum of the cameras was the only sound I heard, along with the occasional creak of the building itself. The office, small and dimly lit, had a large window overlooking the main lobby. From there, I could see most of the entryway, including the door that led out into the parking lot. It was, like most of the building, unnervingly silent at this hour. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a clear view of the lobby, where the only source of light came from this single overhead fixture that illuminated the reception desk. The room was a little too cold, and I couldn't help but notice that the silence felt heavier tonight, like the air was thick with something unspoken. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a result of my growing fatigue. But when I glanced at the monitor again, I froze. There, on the screen, was a figure. A dark, human-shaped shadow standing in the middle of the lobby. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. I immediately checked the time, 2:02 a.m. There should have been no one in the building at that hour. I leaned in closer to the monitor, squinting, trying to make sense of the figure. It was standing still, almost too still. The image was grainy, distorted by the low resolution of the cameras. The figure didn't seem to move at all, which made it all the more unsettling. I thought for a moment that it was just a glitch, maybe an issue with the camera, but as I toggled through the different angles, the figure remained in place. It was like it was watching me. I sat there, staring at the monitor in disbelief. My first instinct was to check the building. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe a janitor or another employee had gotten caught in the building after hours. But no, the doors were locked, the security system was in place, and no alarm had gone off. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and rushed out of the security office, making my way down the hallway toward the lobby. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I moved, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got to the lobby, the colder the air seemed to get. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it felt as if the building itself had chilled, as if something unnatural was drawing the warmth from the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the lobby doors and hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before opening them. There was nothing in the lobby. No shadow, no figure. The room was empty, just as it should have been. I blinked, confused and slightly shaken. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the room, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. The reflection of a curtain moving, perhaps, or a spot on the camera lens. But no, this was something different. I walked to the security office again, my mind racing with questions. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality from the late nights? I tried to shake the thoughts off, telling myself that I was just overworked, tired. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I checked the monitors once more. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the image of that shadow from my mind. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. though I found myself glancing at the lobby through the window every few minutes, almost expecting to see the shadow again. But it didn't appear. That was until the following night. I walked into the security office that night, a little more on edge than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I was more aware of the strange silence in the building. It was as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. At 2:10 a.m., it happened again. The monitor flickered briefly, and there, standing in the same spot in the lobby, was the shadowy figure. This time, it wasn't still. It moved, but not in any way I could explain. The figure seemed to shift, as if it was gliding across the floor without making a sound, its movements smooth and fluid. My breath caught in my throat, and I immediately grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the office. This time, I didn't hesitate as much. I bolted toward the lobby, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. As I neared the lobby doors, I could feel the temperature drop even further. The air grew thick and stagnant, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I swung open the door and stepped into the lobby, heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty again. No figure, no shadow, just the usual quiet emptiness. I stood there, confused, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was something else now, something I hadn't noticed before. A strange, acrid smell hung in the air. It was hard to describe, almost metallic, like something decayed. I turned in circles, scanning every corner of the lobby, every shadow, every doorway. But there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. What was going on? Why did I keep seeing the same thing over and over? It wasn't a glitch, that much was clear. The figure was real, at least in some way. And it was becoming more than just an odd occurrence. It was starting to feel personal, like it was deliberately drawing my attention, almost as if it was waiting for me. I couldn't stay in the lobby forever, though. I needed to keep moving, to keep doing my job. So, with a final glance around, I left the lobby and returned to the security office, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even when I sat back down at the desk, I kept looking up at the monitors, half expecting to see the shadow again. It didn't appear again that night, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an odd glitch. Something was happening in this building, something that couldn't be explained away by faulty wiring or my overactive imagination. Something else was here. I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I didn't know how to make it go away. It had been 3 nights since the second encounter with the shadow in the lobby, and I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. The feeling of being watched had become a constant companion, lurking just beneath the surface of my every movement. The building had begun to take on a different atmosphere. There was a sense of something amiss, something I couldn't explain. The silence, once a normal part of my shifts, now felt thick and oppressive. The air in the hall seemed colder, and no matter how much I turned up the heat, I couldn't shake the chill. The shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't just in the lobby, it was in other places too. I saw it in the hallways, caught briefly in the corner of my eye. Each time I looked, it was gone. The figure moved swiftly, too swiftly for me to make sense of, and each time it vanished before I could investigate further. This was no glitch, no simple trick of the light. It was real, whatever it was. It was real. The unease I had felt was no longer just a passing discomfort. It was turning into fear. I had been doing this job for years, and I'd seen my share of strange things, equipment malfunctions, strange sounds, but nothing like this. Nothing that made my skin crawl the way this did. The building felt alive now, as though it was waiting for something. I could feel it in my bones, and I knew deep down that I had to do something about it. The longer I ignored it, the worse it would get. That night, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The figure, whatever it was, had been appearing more frequently, and I needed to understand what was going on. The security monitors were of no help. The figure was always just out of reach of the camera, leaving nothing but static in its wake. I was certain that the camera malfunctioning was not the issue. It was something else, something sinister, and I was going to find out what it was. I started my shift as usual, but tonight, I wasn't planning to sit behind the security desk the entire time. I decided that I would do a sweep of the building, starting with the areas where I had seen the shadow most frequently. The hallways, the stairwell, the storage rooms, those were the places I felt its presence most keenly. The building was unnervingly quiet as I walked down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the old carpet. The lights above me flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Each light felt like an isolated island of brightness in an otherwise dark and quiet sea. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, as if expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. I checked the storage room first. The door was heavy and creaked as I pushed it open. The room inside was dark, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. It was packed with old office furniture, unused equipment, and stacks of boxes. I ran my light over the shelves, examining every corner of the room. The air in here was stale, the smell of dust and cardboard filling my nostrils. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but I felt a nagging sensation at the back of my mind, like something was just beyond my reach, something I couldn't see but could feel. Next, I moved to the stairwell, the heart of the building. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step echoing in the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The higher I went, the more the temperature seemed to drop. The air was thick, heavy, and each breath I took felt cold in my chest. I paused at the top of the stairwell, my flashlight illuminating the long, shadowy corridor ahead of me. It was empty. Too empty. The kind of emptiness that felt unnatural. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of life itself. I moved forward, my feet light, but my heart heavy. As I walked down the corridor, I could hear something faint, almost imperceptible. It was a low sound, like a whisper or a rustle, but when I stopped, it stopped. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear it again, but the silence swallowed the noise whole. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of dread that was crawling up my spine. The building was old, and old buildings creaked and groaned at night. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the building making those sounds. I continued my sweep of the upper floor, checking rooms, peering into dark corners, and listening for any sign of the shadow. The further I went, the more the building seemed to change. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the silence was no longer peaceful. It felt heavy, like something was hiding in it, something waiting. That's when I heard it. A loud bang echoed down the hall, startling me out of my thoughts. It sounded like a door slamming shut, but there were no doors in that part of the building. My heart raced, and I found myself frozen in place for a moment, unsure of whether to investigate or head back to the security office. I couldn't just ignore it, though. I had to know what was happening. I followed the sound to a door at the far end of the hallway, the one that led to the old, abandoned conference room. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from within. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but enough to make me pause. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty. The only thing that stood out was the light, a single bulb overhead that was flickering erratically. My flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on an old wooden table in the center. Nothing appeared to be disturbed, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The table had what looked like dark stains on it, dried and smeared in a way that didn't make sense. It was too deliberate, too methodical to be an accident. I reached out, running my fingers over the surface. The stains felt cold to the touch, like they had been there for a long time. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air. The temperature dropped even further, and the feeling of being watched returned with full force. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping the room again, but this time, something was different. The shadow was there, in the corner of the room, standing completely still. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as though it was waiting for me to make the next move. Then, the bulb above me flickered violently, and the entire room plunged into darkness. I could still feel the shadow, like a heavy weight pressing down on me, but I couldn't see anything. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and when the beam of light finally cut through the darkness, the shadow was gone. I was alone again, but I wasn't sure for how long, and I wasn't sure if I was truly alone. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I bolted out of there, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I thought it might burst. My only thought was to get back to the security office, to return to the one place where I could feel like I had control. But the closer I got to the office, the more I could feel the presence, following me, never quite leaving my side. By the time I reached the security office, I was gasping for breath. I slammed the door shut behind me, my eyes darting to the monitors once again, but they offered no comfort. The figures, the shadows, they had returned. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. It was becoming clear that whatever was in this building, it wasn't going to leave me alone. The building was now a place of endless tension, every hallway feeling longer than the last. My heart was still racing from my recent encounter with the shadow, but now something new was weighing on me. Something worse. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It wasn't just the odd noises or the flickering lights. No, something was building in the air, a presence that was so thick, I could feel it pressing down on my chest. The shadow had become more aggressive, more present, following me in and out of rooms, waiting for me in places I least expected. And each time I looked back, there was that familiar dark shape standing just beyond the range of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting bolder. It was watching me, waiting for something. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. My shift had been dragging on for hours, and I was on edge, walking through the hallways in a daze, when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like something or someone scraping against the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. I slowly turned my head, searching the hallway, and that's when I saw it. There, at the end of the corridor, was the figure, standing still. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, like a person, but a person made of darkness. I could see no features, no face, just a dark mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. I could feel my blood run cold as I stood frozen in place. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thickening as the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling level. It was as though the shadow was calling me, pulling me towards it. And for some inexplicable reason, my body moved on its own. I couldn't stop myself. My feet carried me down the hallway, closer to the figure, each step feeling more like a struggle, my heartbeat pounding in my chest. I was so close now, too close. The darkness wrapped around me like a blanket, suffocating and all-encompassing. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The figure was so still, yet I knew it was aware of me, its presence undeniable. As I stepped closer, the air seemed to shimmer, like the building itself was warping around me. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I could feel an intense pressure, like the air was being sucked from my lungs. And then, without warning, it moved. The figure lunged at me with an unnatural speed, its form shifting and twisting as it closed the distance between us. I stumbled backward, my body reacting without thought, but it was too late. The shadow grabbed me, its cold fingers wrapping around my arm like ice. I could feel the energy being drained from me, the life force leaving my body. My head spun, and I was paralyzed by a sense of pure terror. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. It was like my voice had been stolen from me. The shadow pulled me closer, and in that moment, I saw something that shook me to my core. The face, if you could call it, that emerged from the darkness. It wasn't a face in the traditional sense. It was a grotesque, distorted mass of shadows, with shifting shapes and whispers that I couldn't make sense of. Eyes, if you could even call them eyes, appeared in the blackness, staring into mine with a cold, unfeeling gaze. I could feel the emptiness in those eyes, a deep, soul-crushing void that seemed to pull at my very essence. I was drowning in that gaze, unable to break free. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, held captive by the figure's unnatural force. The air around me felt like it was alive, the building itself pulsing with an unholy energy. The pressure in my chest intensified as I gasped for breath, but nothing would come. The figure's grip tightened, and I could feel my mind starting to unravel, as if it was being slowly, painfully erased. Just as I thought I would lose my sanity, the building seemed to shake. The walls groaned, and a deep, unnatural hum filled the air. It was as though the very foundation of the building was being torn apart. The figure loosened its grip for a moment, and I took that fleeting second to break free. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled away, stumbling backward as the shadow's grip slipped off me. I was gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. But the figure wasn't done with me yet. It loomed in front of me again, its form distorting, growing larger, its shape flickering in and out of focus. I knew now that this wasn't just some apparition or hallucination. This was something far worse, something ancient, something evil. I could feel the malevolent energy radiating from it, and I knew that it wasn't going to let me go. I backed away, desperate to escape, but the building seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in. I had nowhere to go. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but it felt like it would never end. Each step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into some dark abyss. My legs were trembling, and the overwhelming sense of dread made it impossible to think clearly. I had to get out of here. In a blind panic, I turned and bolted toward the stairwell. My feet slapped against the floor as I ran, the noise echoing through the hall, but all I could hear was the deafening hum of the building. The shadow was following me again, just behind me, getting closer with every step. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, it would be the last thing I ever did. I reached the stairwell and ran up the steps, my lungs burning as I pushed myself harder. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the hall, was another figure, another shadow. The same dark shape, standing motionless, waiting. It was blocking my only escape. I was trapped. The building had become a maze, and I was the prey. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in on me from all sides. The walls seemed to be shifting, the floor trembling beneath my feet. The oppressive weight of the atmosphere was crushing me, and I couldn't breathe. I was suffocating under the pressure of it all. I was at the mercy of whatever was controlling this place, this cursed building. And the worst part, I wasn't sure it was even a place anymore. It felt alive, and it was hungry. Suddenly, everything went dark. The hum of the building stopped, and the oppressive pressure lifted. I stood there, disoriented, unable to move. I felt lightheaded, as if the very air around me had been sucked away. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered in my ear, cold, emotionless, and full of malice. "You are not meant to leave." And just like that, the world around me went completely silent. I didn't know how much time had passed since the darkness swallowed the room. Seconds, minutes, hours, nothing felt real anymore. The voice that had whispered in my ear lingered in my mind, its words like a heavy weight on my chest. "You are not meant to leave." The chill in the air had been replaced with an unnerving stillness, like the world itself had frozen in time. My body trembled uncontrollably, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I knew I had to escape. It was the only thing that mattered anymore. Whatever force had taken hold of the building, whatever dark entity was haunting this place, I had to get away from it. But how? The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air felt thicker with each passing second. It was as if the building itself was alive, trapping me within its walls. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from sheer exhaustion and fear. But then, something changed. A faint light appeared ahead of me, flickering at first, like a beacon in the distance. It was so subtle, I almost missed it. I couldn't help myself. I stumbled toward it, each step heavy and uncertain. The building seemed to resist, but the light felt like my only hope, the only thing that could guide me out of this nightmare. As I walked, the hum in the air returned, but this time it wasn't as oppressive. The temperature felt slightly warmer, and the silence began to lift. I reached the source of the light, a single overhead bulb, flickering in a small storage closet at the end of the hall. It wasn't much, just a single dim light hanging from a chain. But to me, it felt like a salvation. I stepped inside the closet, desperate to find anything that could help. The door to the storage closet slammed shut behind me, and I didn't dare turn around to look. For a few moments, I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to steady myself. The shadows still lingered in the corners of my vision, and I could feel them pressing in on me. But now, I wasn't entirely alone. The presence of whatever had been haunting this place seemed to have diminished. It was like the light had pushed it back. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to breathe. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but this brief moment of relief was enough to give me the clarity I needed. There had to be a way out. I scanned the closet. It was just a small room, filled with dusty boxes and old, forgotten equipment. Nothing of particular interest, nothing useful, except for one thing: an old, rusty fire exit ladder at the far end of the room. It was hidden behind a stack of boxes, almost as if it had been deliberately left there to be forgotten. My eyes locked onto it. This was it, the way out. But I had to be quick. I didn't know how much time I had before the darkness returned, before the entity would reclaim the building. Without hesitation, I rushed over to the ladder, pulling aside the heavy boxes. I could hear the distant hum of the building growing louder, and I knew the shadows were closing in on me again. The ladder creaked as I unfolded it, and I almost couldn't believe my luck. It was a fire exit. I was getting out. I quickly began climbing. With every step, I felt the weight of the building's malevolent presence trying to drag me back down, but I refused to stop. My legs ached, my chest burned from the effort, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept climbing. The higher I went, the more I felt like I was escaping, like I was leaving behind the nightmare, leaving behind the haunting, leaving behind everything that had happened here. When I reached the top of the ladder, I found a small hatch, barely big enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't think twice. I pulled it open and climbed through into the attic space. The air was stale and dusty, but it was a welcome change from the suffocating darkness below. I wasn't safe yet, but I was closer. The attic was large and cluttered, with old furniture and forgotten belongings scattered across the floor. It was quiet here, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself a moment of peace. I took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I had to find an exit. As I moved toward the far side of the attic, I stumbled upon an old window. It was small, but it was open. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. I pushed aside the debris and climbed toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the window open, the rusty hinges screeching in protest. The fresh air outside felt like a lifeline, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to feel a sliver of hope. But even then, I knew the danger wasn't over. The building wasn't done with me. The shadows were still out there, and I couldn't risk letting them catch up with me now. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled myself through the window, feeling the cold air hit my face as I tumbled onto the rooftop. I landed hard, but I didn't care. I was out. I was free. I didn't waste any time. I scrambled to my feet, looking around for a way to escape. The building loomed behind me, dark and foreboding, but I couldn't look back. I ran, not daring to stop, until I finally reached the edge of the roof. Below me was the alleyway, dimly lit and narrow, but it was my only way out. I jumped. I don't know how I made it, how I didn't break my legs or worse, but I landed hard, pain shooting through my body as I rolled onto the pavement. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I got to my feet and ran, my heart racing as I dashed down the alley. I heard nothing behind me. No footsteps, no whispers, no sounds of pursuit. It was as if the building had let me go. For now, I didn't look back, and I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. My chest heaved with every breath, and my legs felt like jelly, but I was alive. I had made it. The shadows had lost their grip on me for now. When I finally reached safety, I stopped and collapsed against a lamppost, my body trembling with exhaustion. I looked around, half expecting to see the building looming behind me, but it was gone. It had vanished into the night, just like the shadows that haunted it. But even though I had escaped, I knew one thing. I would never forget that place. I would never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being trapped in a building that wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever dark force had been behind that place would always be out there, waiting for the next person to stumble into its grasp. And for the rest of my life, I would wonder, was it truly over? Or was it just waiting for me to return? As the days passed, I found myself trying to go back to normal life. I went back to my routine, the quiet hum of everyday existence resuming. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the mundane, my job, the occasional trip to the store, the routine of my days, the memories haunted me. The echo of that dark presence followed me, an invisible shadow that clung to me in the back of my mind. I knew it was irrational. I knew it wasn't logical to keep thinking about that night. But I couldn't help myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the darkness hadn't completely let go of me. I'd returned to the building only once after the night I escaped. It was only for a brief visit, to grab a few of my belongings I'd left behind. The place had been cleared out, sold to a new owner. The walls were freshly painted, the floors stripped and redone. Everything looked new, too new, but the air felt different. It felt oppressive. The shadows in the corners still whispered, even in the bright daylight. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel that same presence, lurking in the walls, just waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to enter. I left without looking back. That was a few months ago. Since then, I've done my best to move on, to forget, to push it all down and live my life. I've gotten used to the quiet, normal life I once had, or at least I've tried to. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my apartment, when the lights flicker or the air grows heavy, I feel it again. The darkness. It's not as intense as it was that night, but it's there, lurking in the corners of my mind. The whispers return in the silence, and I wonder, is it really gone? I know I shouldn't believe in these things. I know the rational part of me says it's just my mind playing tricks. But the fear I felt that night, it was real. It was as real as the air I breathe. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I feel an icy chill creeping into the room. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I can't help but feel the same weight that pressed down on me in that building. The same sense of being watched, of being trapped. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape the effects of what happened. Maybe that darkness is still out there, still waiting for its next victim. Maybe it's already found someone else. Or maybe, just maybe, it never left me. As I lie in bed each night, I often wonder if I'll hear the voice again. That voice that whispered in my ear, cold and unnatural. You are not meant to leave. It has never left me, not really. It's as if it's a part of me now, forever ingrained in my memory, lingering in the corners of my mind, like a dark stain I can never wash away. But then, there are nights when I find some small sense of peace, a sense of normalcy, even if it's fleeting. I go to bed, turning off the lights, and for a moment, I allow myself to believe that it's all behind me. That the darkness, the shadows, the things that haunted me are gone. But no matter how hard I try to believe that it's over, I always find myself glancing over my shoulder. I can't stop myself from wondering, what if it's still out there? What if it's waiting for me to return? What if that building, that dark place, is still holding its breath, waiting to draw me back in? I don't know the answers to these questions. I don't think I ever will. The only thing I can do now is keep living, keep moving forward. But in the back of my mind, that shadow is always there. And I know, deep down, it's never really over. Not for me. Not for anyone who's encountered it. And as I sit here now, in the quiet of my apartment, with nothing but the hum of the city outside my window, I realize something. No matter how much time passes, no matter how far I run, that night will always be with me. The fear, the darkness, the whispers, they are a part of me now. And I will carry them for the rest of my life. I don't know if the building still stands, or if it's been torn down. I don't know if anyone else has experienced what I did. I don't know if I was just a victim of my own fear, or if there really was something dark and malevolent in that place. But I do know one thing. There are some things in this world that can't be explained. There are some forces that go beyond our understanding. And once you encounter them, once you come face to face with that kind of darkness, you can never truly walk away. The sound of waves crashing against the shore, the smell of salt in the air, it all calms the mind in a way nothing else could. So when I was offered the job of lighthouse keeper on a small island off the coast, I couldn't resist. It wasn't a glamorous job, and it certainly wasn't easy. But there was a peace to it, a quiet kind of solitude. The island was remote, so isolated that the only people I saw were the occasional supply boat that came by every few weeks. No visitors, no distractions, just me, the lighthouse, and the ocean. The job required a routine. Every evening, I climbed to the top of the lighthouse, making sure the light was working, shining its beam across the dark waters. I kept the machinery clean and maintained the logs. It was mostly uneventful work, and that suited me just fine. The solitude, the calmness, it was perfect for someone like me. I wasn't alone, though. There was the lighthouse assistant, someone who helped with the mundane tasks and was around when the boat came by to bring supplies. His name was David, a younger man, eager and hardworking. He'd been working here for a few months before I arrived, but he was quiet, with a kind of nervous energy. He didn't speak much about his past, but he was polite, and we worked well together. Most of the time, the days would pass without much happening. I'd spend my mornings walking along a rocky shoreline, collecting driftwood, or just listening to the sound of the waves. David would clean the lantern room, tend to the garden around the lighthouse, and spend time inside reading. There wasn't much else to do. We didn't have a television or internet, just books and each other's company. The evenings were quiet too. The only sounds were the constant rumbling of the ocean and the occasional screech of a gull overhead. We'd have dinner together, usually something simple, fish from the waters nearby, or bread and stew. Once the meal was over, we'd head to our separate rooms. I took the room on the top floor of the lighthouse, while David stayed downstairs. Both rooms had large windows, offering breathtaking views of the sea and sky. But despite the beauty of the place, there was a strange feeling that lingered, one I couldn't shake. It wasn't anything that I could point to directly. Nothing that screamed danger or evil. It was more of a feeling in my gut, like being watched, or perhaps like the island itself was. Alive. But that wasn't something I told David. I thought it was just the isolation getting to me, the silence playing tricks on my mind. After all, who wouldn't feel a bit unsettled when surrounded by nothing but the ocean for miles around. Still, I knew something wasn't quite right. Sometimes, late at night, when the light from the lantern room would shine across the water, I could swear I saw something moving out there. Just beyond the reach of the light, in the dark, I would catch glimpses of shapes large, shadowy figures that would vanish when the beam swept across them. So when I looked back, nothing was there. It was easy to dismiss these things. The ocean played tricks on your eyes sometimes, especially at night. It was probably just the darkness and my tired mind, I thought. But as the days went on, I began to notice other things, small things at first, things that could easily be explained away. But as time passed, they began to add up, and that's when I started to realize something was wrong on that island. Something I wasn't prepared for. It started small, something that could easily be overlooked, just another oddity of island life. But looking back, I realized it was the first true sign that something was wrong. It was an early evening, about 2 weeks after I had settled in. The weather had been a bit turbulent lately, with gusts of wind that made the lighthouse shake in its foundation. I stood at the lantern room, as usual, adjusting the light. The bulb flickered slightly, and I thought nothing of it at first. It happened sometimes. The wiring was old, and there was nothing to do but wait for the supply boat to bring replacements. But then the flickering grew more persistent. A low hum began to fill the room, vibrating through the floorboards. I leaned in closer to the lantern, staring at the light in confusion. It flickered again, this time with such intensity that I could see the beam wavering. It didn't make sense. There was no storm, no power surge, just the steady rhythm of wind and waves outside. I reached for the control panel, checking the switches and the dimming controls. That's when I noticed something strange. The air around me felt colder. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but the temperature had definitely dropped. I tugged my sweater tighter, trying to shake off the sensation. I had heard stories of how isolated places like this could affect the mind, how the endless quiet could sometimes play tricks on you. But this didn't feel like a trick. I turned my gaze toward the window. The wind had picked up, battering against the lighthouse with a new intensity. The waves outside crashed against the rocks violently, the moonlit sky barely visible through the spray. But it wasn't the storm or the sea that unsettled me. It was the shadows. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move across the window. It wasn't the usual play of light and shadow caused by the swirling wind or the waves crashing on the rocks. No, this was different. A figure. Tall, broad, its outline faint but undeniable. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, the shadows playing tricks on my tired mind. The light flickered again, and I quickly adjusted it, hoping to get everything back to normal. But the strange feeling didn't go away. It was as though the lighthouse itself was waiting, holding its breath. Later that night, after I had finished my rounds, I met up with David for dinner. I didn't mention what had happened earlier, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. We ate in silence, the soft light from the oil lamps casting long shadows against the walls. David, ever the quiet one, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He chewed slowly, his eyes flickering toward the window every so often, as if distracted. "How's the light?" he asked after a while, breaking the silence. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "It's just flickering a bit. I'll have to check it again tomorrow." David nodded, but didn't respond further. That night, when we both retreated to our rooms, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about the shadow, the figure. I couldn't rationalize it, couldn't explain it away as easily as I wanted to. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that the isolation was getting to me, that my mind was creating things. But something inside me, some deep instinct, told me it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the unease. The sky was clear, the sea calm. I went to the lantern room to check the light, making sure everything was in order. But as I was about to climb the ladder to the top, I noticed something strange on the floor beneath me. A set of footprints. They were faint, the edges blurry, but they were definitely their barefoot prints in the dust, leading from the door and towards the windows. The thing that unsettled me wasn't just the footprints, though. It was the fact that they weren't mine, and they weren't David's either. We both had shoes on when we came in. I knelt down to inspect them, my stomach twisting. There was no way David could have made them, not without me hearing him. The lighthouse was silent, every noise amplified in the stillness of the morning. I called out for David, but he didn't answer. I ran down the spiral staircase to check his room, my heart pounding. His door was locked. I knocked repeatedly, calling his name, but there was no answer. Panic began to creep in, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. What if he had gone out last night? I thought, my mind racing. But he was supposed to stay inside, especially with the storm picking up. And if he had gone out, why didn't I hear him? I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. Inside, the room was empty, the bed untouched. But there was something odd, something I couldn't place. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. I walked over and closed it, my mind struggling to make sense of the situation. As I left his room and returned to the lantern room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footprints, the open window, David's absence, it was all too much. I knew David had been in the lighthouse when I went to bed last night. But now, it seemed like he had disappeared into thin air. By evening, I still hadn't seen him. I tried calling out for him, pacing around the lighthouse, but there was no answer. I even searched the island, checking every nook and cranny, but he was gone. The waves crashed against the shore, the wind howling through the rocks. The only sounds were the ones of nature, as if the island itself was trying to tell me something. As I sat alone in the lighthouse that night, a thought crossed my mind. Had David ever really been here at all? It was a chilling idea, one that I dismissed as quickly as it came. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. There had been something strange about him, something I hadn't been able to place. And now, as I stared into the empty lighthouse, I realized that David's disappearance wasn't just a matter of him wandering off. It was as though he had never been there to begin with. The unsettling feeling in my gut grew stronger, gnawing at me as I sat in the lantern room, alone. The wind outside howled, the lighthouse groaned, and I waited for the next sign, whatever it might be. I knew then that whatever was happening on this island, it wasn't just an accident. Something was out there, something that had taken David, and it wasn't going to stop. I couldn't tell if the fog in my mind was from lack of sleep, or if it was the strange air of the lighthouse itself that had begun to suffocate me. The island felt different, heavier, as though a weight was pressing down on everything, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't remember the last time I felt truly alone. Even though there was no one physically around me, the sensation of being watched followed me wherever I went. I spent the next few days combing the lighthouse, scouring every inch of the island for any trace of David. There were no footprints, no clues, no signs of a struggle. It was as though he had simply vanished. The emptiness was suffocating. It gnawed at my mind until the only thing I could focus on was the quiet, deep, suffocating silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence you could escape, the kind that creeps under your skin and settles in your bones. I could hear things that shouldn't be there. The softest of whispers on the wind, the faint scraping of metal on metal late at night when I thought I was the only one awake. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me or the old building settling, but as the days dragged on, the sounds grew harder to ignore. The first thing that happened was the light. It was the same lantern that had flickered before, but this time it was different. The beam grew stronger at night, burning brighter than usual. I didn't understand it. The power supply hadn't changed, nor had I made any adjustments to the mechanism. Yet, each time I went to check on it, I found the light burning more fiercely than it should. One night, as I was standing in the lantern room, watching the sea churn below, I felt a cold gust of wind blow through the open window, even though the weather was calm. The flame flickered violently, then steadied as though it had been shielded from the wind. I turned around in confusion, but there was no explanation for it. The feeling in the room became oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on me, the faint smell of salt water and dampness growing stronger. Then came the whispers. Low, unintelligible, but undeniably there. I was certain I wasn't imagining it. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, filled with something unspoken. The sound didn't come from outside or from the wind. It was coming from within the lighthouse itself. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I had to get out. The following morning, I decided to investigate. I was no longer willing to pass off what was happening as coincidence or the result of being alone for too long. I needed answers. I went back to the lantern room, hoping to find something that could explain what was happening to me, to the lighthouse. The room was just as I left it, cold, dark, and empty. I stood in the middle, looking around, trying to understand what I was missing. I paced back and forth, running my fingers over the walls, hoping for some sign of change, some clue that could lead me to David, or at least explain the unsettling things I had been hearing. It was then that I noticed the floor. There was something odd about it. The dust had been disturbed, as though someone had walked through the room recently, though I was certain I had been the only one there. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I crouched down to inspect the ground more closely. That's when I saw its scratches, long and deep, scarring the wooden floor. I traced the marks with my fingers, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The scratches led to the wall where the whispers had come from. I pressed my ear to the cold stone, my breath catching in my throat. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. The whispers weren't coming from behind the wall, though. They were coming from within the room, just beneath the floor. Panic gripped me. I had to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the room had become a trap, holding me in place. The longer I stood there, the more the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped further, until I could see my breath in the air. I couldn't understand what was happening. The lighthouse was supposed to be just a building, nothing more, nothing less. But it felt alive now, like it had a mind of its own. I bolted from the lantern room, my heart pounding. I needed fresh air. I needed to breathe. The wind was howling outside, the sea crashing violently against the rocks. I stood by the door, feeling the chill of the night air sting my face. But even outside, the eerie feeling followed me. I could feel eyes on me, could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. That night, I was unable to sleep. The shadows in my room seemed to grow darker, the space between the walls closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds returned soft at first, barely perceptible, but undeniable. A faint tapping from the far corner of the room. A scrape against the door frame. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the source of the noise. My hands trembled as I approached the door. When I opened it, the silence hit me like a physical blow. There was nothing there. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, an old photograph, one that wasn't there before. It was framed, resting on the small table beside my bed. I walked over and picked it up, my fingers shaking. The image was of a lighthouse, much like the one I was standing in, though it looked far older. In the foreground stood two men, smiling, but their faces were faded, and their eyes, there was something wrong with their eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. I dropped the photo, my heart racing. I searched the room, tearing through every drawer, every corner. The room was empty, save for that picture. But something was off, something beyond just the photo. It was the air thick, heavy, almost suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, and every time I looked at the photograph, I felt like someone was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The days turned into weeks, and the incidents only became more frequent. I would hear footsteps behind me when I walked down the empty halls, the softest scrape of shoes on wood. The whispers would return, but this time I could make out words, though they were always in a language I didn't understand. I tried everything I could to calm my nerves. I walked the perimeter of the lighthouse, checked the light and its mechanisms, but nothing seemed to make a difference. Every time I thought I had a handle on the situation, something else would happen. One morning, I found a puddle of water in the middle of the room, despite the fact that no one had been near it. Another time, I woke up to find a chair had been moved, positioned in front of the window, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the sea. The tension became unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything. Each time I ventured into the lantern room, it felt like the air itself was closing in, the pressure rising. I could see shadows moving at the edges of my vision, hear strange tapping and scraping noises beneath the floor. And always, the whispering. That low, urgent whisper, just below the threshold of hearing. I knew I needed to figure out what was happening. I had to confront whatever was haunting this place, or I would go mad. But every time I thought I was close, the answers slipped further out of reach. The more I investigated, the more I realized there was no escaping whatever was here. And it was only a matter of time before it would make itself known, whether I was ready or not. The island, the lighthouse, the silence, they weren't just empty spaces anymore. They were filled with something. Something old, something angry, and I was trapped here with it. The weight of the lighthouse seemed to press on me with every passing hour, growing heavier and more unbearable. It felt as though the entire island itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. I couldn't take it any longer. The whispering had become constant, echoing in the walls, beneath the floor, in my head. Each day, the strange events grew more intense, more purposeful. The temperature dropped even further, and the air became thick with something ancient and malevolent. I could feel it, deep in my bones, the feeling of being watched. And it wasn't just the walls anymore. The very sea itself seemed to be alive, churning and howling as if trying to reach the shore. The lighthouse, this crumbling structure I had come to know as home, was no longer a shelter. It had become a prison. The shadows in the corners of my eyes were darker now, more defined, and they moved when I wasn't looking. I no longer felt safe anywhere. But I had no choice. I had to stay, had to keep going, because the only alternative was to run. And I wasn't sure I could. That night, everything changed. I was sitting in the small room that served as my quarters, trying to make sense of what was happening. The light had flickered again, brighter than usual, casting long shadows across the floor. The whispers were louder now, urgent, as if something or someone was calling to me. I stood up from the chair, my heart racing, my palms sweating. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was haunting this place. I had to know the truth. The lantern room seemed the most logical place to start. If anything was going to reveal itself, it would be there, at the heart of the lighthouse, where the light burned so brightly every night. I grabbed my flashlight, my breath shallow in my chest, and made my way up the winding stairs. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the building, but I was too focused on what lay ahead to notice. The only sound I could hear now was the pounding of my own heartbeat. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment. The door to the lantern room was slightly ajar, but there was no light spilling out, no sign that anyone had been there. My fingers trembled as I pushed it open, the door creaking loudly in the stillness. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, the chill cutting through my clothes and straight to my bones. The lantern, which had always been burning so brightly, was now dim. The light flickered weakly, casting eerie, uneven shadows across the room. And that's when I saw something moving in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the far end of the room, near the window. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. It wasn't human. It was something else, something far older, far more malevolent. The room seemed to grow colder still as the figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules that governed everything else. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, and the temperature dropped even further. A low, guttural sound filled the air, a growling noise that didn't come from anywhere human. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt the walls closing in. The air grew thick, heavy, like I was breathing underwater. The figure was getting closer, its form becoming more defined, more solid. It reached out toward me, its long fingers stretching toward my face. I stumbled backward, tripping over the chair behind me, my mind racing for some way to escape. The whispers became deafening now, drowning out everything else. I could no longer distinguish the words, but I could feel the presence in the room, surrounding me, suffocating me. The figure's fingers brushed against my cheek, ice cold and unyielding, sending a jolt of panic through my body. "David!" I shouted, my voice breaking. I had to reach him. I had to get him back. I had to understand what had happened to him. But the figure didn't respond. It merely tilted its head, almost as if it was studying me, weighing me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared into the darkness where its eyes should have been. The presence was overwhelming, suffocating. And in that moment, I realized something David wasn't just missing. He was part of whatever this was. He had become a part of the lighthouse, a part of the darkness that clung to it. Suddenly, the air around me shifted. The whispers stopped. The temperature rose just a fraction, and the figure in front of me disappeared. I stood there, gasping for breath, my chest heaving as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. My mind was spinning, racing to make sense of it all. I wasn't alone in that room. And whatever had just shown itself to me, whatever I had seen, it wasn't finished. It wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled out of the lantern room, my legs weak beneath me. The moment I left, the whispers started again, soft at first, like a breath on the wind, but growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't get away from them. They were in my head now, twisting around my thoughts, dragging me back toward the room, toward the darkness. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. My flashlight trembled in my grip, its beam barely cutting through the dark. But even in the dim light, I could see it. The figure was no longer in the lantern room. It was everywhere now, its shadow stretching across the walls, its whispers in my ear. I was losing my mind. The pressure was too much, the terror too great. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. As I stumbled out of the lighthouse, gasping for air, I found myself standing at the edge of the cliff, the sea crashing below. The wind howled around me, but it couldn't drown out the whispers. They were in my ears now, inside my mind, swirling around my thoughts. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the noise, trying to steady my breath. The shadows were moving again, circling me, drawing closer. I knew, deep in my gut, that I couldn't escape this. The lighthouse had become something else, something that would never let me go. And as I turned around to face the darkness, I understood the truth. David wasn't lost. He had been claimed. And now I was next. The figure stepped from the shadows once more, its long fingers reaching toward me. I could see its face now, a twisted, broken visage of a man, eyes wide and unblinking. It was David. But it wasn't. The figure was him, but not him. The light from the lighthouse flickered faintly in the distance, and I could feel the weight of it all crushing me. I screamed. And then, everything went black. What happened next, I couldn't tell you. My mind went blank, everything faded into nothingness. But when I woke up, I was alone. The lighthouse was still there, towering over me, but the whispers were gone. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone too. But I knew, deep down, that it hadn't finished with me. The lighthouse had marked me. And sooner or later, it would come for me again. The wind howled around me as I stood at the edge of the lighthouse, my breath shallow and ragged. The shadows had receded into the night, but their presence lingered like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, still feel the cold touch of that thing, the figure that had once been David clinging to me, even though I had run. But somehow, I was still here. I hadn't been consumed, not yet. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to understand what had happened. I tried to shake the images from my mind, tried to forget the twisted figure of David, the way it had reached out to me with such an unnatural calm. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, his face, distorted and broken, a mirror of the lighthouse's darkness. I had to leave. I knew that. I had to get as far from this place as possible before it claimed me, before I too became part of whatever cursed existence lingered in the walls of that lighthouse. I turned away from the cliffside, my legs unsteady beneath me as I staggered toward the entrance. The familiar steps of the lighthouse felt alien beneath my feet, like a trap I had willingly walked into. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I winced at the sound, half expecting something or someone to be waiting for me on the other side. But there was nothing. The interior of the lighthouse was as cold and silent as ever, the dim light from the lantern room casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. But the room wasn't empty. As I stepped inside, I felt a sudden surge of dread claw at my chest. The whispers had returned, softer now, like a distant hum in the background of my mind. I looked around, expecting to see some sign of the figure, some trace of the horror that had gripped me earlier. But there was nothing. The room was exactly as it had always been. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. I made my way toward the stairs, my every step echoing in the stillness. The lighthouse was alive, I realized, its walls closing in on me, suffocating me. The darkness that had once seemed distant now felt so much closer, as if it were watching me from every angle, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but I kept moving, climbing the stairs as quickly as I could, determined to reach the top. The lantern room, the source of all the madness, the place where it had all started, felt like the only place I could go. I needed to see it again, to make sure that it was truly gone, that the darkness hadn't followed me up. When I reached the top, I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. I was almost there. The whispers were louder now, buzzing in my head like a swarm of angry bees, but I ignored them. I had to face it. I had to face whatever was left. The lantern room was just as it had been, the dim light flickering weakly in the center of the room. But something was different. There was a faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from the far corner where the figure had stood. My eyes narrowed, and I stepped forward, feeling my heartbeat quicken once more. There, in the corner, was the object that had been haunting me in my nightmares, a faded photograph, crumpled and torn, as if it had been thrown aside in a hurry. I reached down and picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was a photo of David, but it wasn't the David I had known. This was the David I had seen in that moment of terror, the one whose face was twisted with malice and hatred. His eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, stared back at me from the photograph. And beneath his image were words, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "It's too late." I froze, the words sinking in slowly, like ice water pouring over me. Too late? What did that mean? I had to get out. The weight of the moment hit me all at once, and I knew I had been wrong. Running wouldn't save me. It wouldn't matter how far I went. The lighthouse had already claimed me, and now it wanted more. I stumbled back from the photograph, my mind racing to make sense of it all. I looked around the room, feeling the walls pressing in on me again. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the air with a maddening chorus. It was as if the lighthouse itself was breathing, its pulse quickening in response to the darkness that had consumed it. I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned on my heel and sprinted down the stairs, the frantic beat of my heart pounding in my chest. My legs burned as I reached the bottom, my hands shaking as I grabbed for the door. I had to leave now. But when I opened the door, I was met with an unsettling sight. The world outside had changed. The cliffside was gone. The sea had disappeared, replaced by an endless stretch of darkness that seemed to swallow the landscape whole. There was no horizon, no stars, just an expanse of black stretching into infinity. And in the center of it all, The lighthouse loomed, its beam of light cutting through the void like an accusing finger. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and I felt the overwhelming pressure of the darkness pressing in around me. It was as though the lighthouse had become a part of the night itself, a twisted, unholy thing that refused to let go. I stepped outside, my feet sinking into the cold earth. The whispers grew louder, their words indistinguishable now, but I could feel them crawling under my skin, like insects burrowing deep inside. I looked back at the lighthouse, and for a moment, I saw something, a shadow standing in the doorway, watching me. David, or what had once been David. It was too late. There was no escaping it. I turned away, walking into the void, knowing that there was no place left to run. The lighthouse had claimed me, just as it had claimed David. I didn't know how, or why, or what had become of my friend. But I knew this, whatever had happened to him, it was now happening to me, and there would be no return. I don't know how long I wandered in the dark, the whispers trailing behind me like a shadow. Time had no meaning here. I had no sense of where I was, no understanding of what had become of the world around me. All I knew was that the lighthouse, the thing that had haunted my every thought, was still out there. And it was waiting for me. The end had come, but it wasn't the end I had imagined. It was something worse, something more terrifying than anything I could have ever prepared for. And now, there was no way out. The darkness had swallowed everything. I couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't breathe without feeling the weight of it closing in around me. The lighthouse was still there, its light flickering weakly through the endless black, casting a pale glow that seemed to have no source and no end. I walked, or perhaps stumbled, through the emptiness. My legs ached, my body heavy, as though I were carrying the weight of the very night itself. The ground beneath my feet felt strange, not solid, not real. It was as though I was walking through a dream, a nightmare where the rules of the world no longer applied, where nothing made sense, where I had no control. My mind felt fractured, disjointed, like the fragments of my memories were scattered across this cold, infinite darkness. There were no stars, no moon, no horizon, nothing to indicate that the world I once knew even existed anymore. There was only the ever-present whisper of the lighthouse, cutting through the blackness like a blade, its beam a cruel reminder that it was still there, watching, waiting. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed David. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had looked before he changed. He hadn't wanted it, I knew that. He hadn't wanted to become that twisted thing, whatever it was that had reached out for me in the dark. But it hadn't mattered. Once you entered the lighthouse, once you became part of its curse, you were never free. It owned you, it consumed you, and it kept you. What had I become? The question burned in my mind, but I had no answer. I had tried to run, tried to fight it, but there was no fighting this. There was no escape from the darkness once it had you in its grasp. I couldn't help but think back to when I first arrived at the lighthouse. I had been so full of confidence, so sure that I could handle it. It had seemed like a simple job, a routine task, just a few months of solitude, of keeping the light running, maintaining the signal for passing ships. How could I have known that the lighthouse was not just a structure, but something far more insidious? That it wasn't just a place, but a force that preyed on the weak, on the lost, on those who dared to venture too close. Now I was lost. Lost in a place that didn't exist, in a world that had no rules. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but I could still feel their presence, still hear their echoes in the back of my mind. They were always there, like the slow creep of a shadow, following me no matter where I went. They had become a part of me, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I wasn't just walking through the dark, I was becoming part of it. I was becoming part of the lighthouse. The realization struck me harder than anything I had ever felt before. It was an ache that went deeper than my bones, deeper than my soul. I had been changed, twisted by the very place I had tried to control. There was no returning to who I had been, no going back to the life I once knew. I was now just another piece of the lighthouse history, another soul trapped in its endless grasp. The wind howled again, a bitter cold that cut through my clothes, through my skin, until I felt numb. My body had long since grown tired, my legs weak from the journey through the darkness, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop walking, couldn't stop searching for something, anything that might bring an end to this twisted existence. The lighthouse's light grew brighter, closer, until it was blinding. I shielded my eyes, but it didn't help. The light was all-encompassing, overwhelming, pulling me in, forcing me toward it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The darkness closed in around me again, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, the darkness felt familiar, like an old friend, like something I had always known. I stood there in the quiet, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was deafening, suffocating. I thought I had heard the whispers again, but now they were different. Now they seemed to come from within me, as though I was the one who was whispering, the one who was now part of whatever had consumed David. I was part of the lighthouse. The lighthouse was part of me. The question I had asked myself earlier, what had I become, seemed pointless now. It didn't matter. I was here, in this place, lost in the darkness, with no hope of ever finding my way back. It was as if I had stepped outside of time itself, outside of everything I had known, and now I was just another lost soul wandering in the void, a ghost of the man I once was. I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. What had I thought? That I could escape? That I could leave the lighthouse and live? The lighthouse had claimed me long before I had even set foot inside it. It had taken me, and now it would never let me go. And so I kept walking. There was no escape. There never had been. I don't know how long I've been here now. It could be days. It could be weeks, or it could be longer. The passage of time has no meaning in this place. But I know one thing for certain now. I am no longer who I was. I've become a part of the lighthouse, a part of the darkness. And as the whispers grow louder, as the light flickers in the distance, I realize something else, that I am not alone. David is here, too. I can feel him, feel his presence in the silence. We are all here, trapped, waiting for the next person to wander too close, to enter the lighthouse grasp. And when they do, when they become part of this nightmare, we will be there to welcome them. The lighthouse has claimed us all. And now, we are the whispers in the dark. We are the shadows that will never fade.